Today is Thursday, May 11th, 2017. I'm your host this afternoon. My name is Crystal Clark. I'm conducting an interview for our good friend Pat over at Information Machine. His website is a great kind of amalgamation of alternative news. His website is information-machine.blogspot.com. My website is drowninginabsurdity.org. And today we have a very controversial guest. His name is James Horak, and his website is emvsinfo.blogspot.com. M as in Mary, V as in Victor, S as in Sam, emvsinfo.blogspot.com. Before we get straight to James and the wonderful insights he always has to share, there is something that I wanted to talk about in the face of our completely out of control surveillance state. I came across a very interesting series on Amazon. It's an Amazon original series, so that's the only place you're going to find it. And it's called The Hand of God. It stars Ron Perlman, who many of you are familiar with. He was the actor that played Hellboy and the Patriarch in the Sons of Anarchy series. Excellent, excellent actor. It's a fantastic series, but something very specific came up in this series that I think our fellow hacktivists and programmers who would really like to see a self-determined life in the future, I think they might really appreciate this. It's a wonderful series. There are 2 seasons, and I'm going to try not to give too many spoilers away. I'm going to try to be careful about how I approach this because it's just wonderful, and I don't want to ruin it for folks. But basically, Ron Perlman is a judge, a very well-known judge, very prominent, whose son is a computer programmer. And he wrote this program called Bathwater. Now, in season 2, episode 2, PJ's mother, PJ has since died, and his mother finds out that he released this manifesto on YouTube before he died, and she's watching it. And I want to read from this manifesto for you because I think it's just so important to really put the surveillance state into perspective. Fair warning, there is vulgar language coming. So if you need a moment to turn your volume down or get your little ones out of the room, now's the time to do it. I want to let you know that I did debate whether or not to include this, but just because it's vulgar doesn't mean it isn't true, and I think that's more important. But I do also want to let you know that this is the only part of the show where you'll find something like this. This isn't meant to set the tone of the show by any means. There are 2 different events that are colliding at this moment in this particular episode. The father, which is Ron Perlman, is somehow getting messages, and he's not sure if they're coming from God or his dead son. And at one point, he just gets really, really far out, and he ends up naked in this public fountain speaking in tongues. And another point in the show, someone, because it was videotaped and put out on YouTube for all the world to see him doing this, and someone decides to take it to a church and see if someone in the church can translate what he said. And what he was saying is basically identical to what his son said in the manifesto, but he's never seen it. And so what you have happening here in this scene is you have PJ speaking, and then it will switch to the woman in the church who's deciphering what the father said while he was speaking in tongues. So for the first half of this, I'm going to let you know which person is speaking, but then I'm just going to just read it all in order because it just becomes so intertwined, it doesn't really matter who's saying what. But the interesting thing about it, and I think one of the reasons that I chose to include this, is because there is a reference to Lucifer, and we do see a rise in Luciferian influence in world politics, especially with the globalist agenda, so I think it's important. So the scene begins. PJ is standing out in the middle of nowhere with this ocean behind him. And he looks back at the ocean and he looks at the camera and he says, "You know what I love the most about this moment? The only person who knows where I am right now is me." Looking back at the ocean, he says, "It's fucking majestic. Like looking into infinity. This is what perfection looks like. Big data hates this place." And then it goes over to the church lady. And she says, "Lucifer is not content with the perfection of God. He despises man because man has the one thing he will never have." And then it goes back over to PJ's manifesto where he says, "Free will. So they trick us. They take everything they know about us and use it against us to control us." And then the church lady says, he rocks us to sleep with lullabies of science, of technology, of knowledge of this world. He wants to use man's own needs and urges to make him weak. And the rest of this just blurs together, so I'm not going to point out who says what. They make it so easy, don't they? We can get a pill for any mood online, come at the click of a button. We Uber our food. I mean, what the fuck? We've given up our right to choose in exchange for free shipping and a money-back guarantee. We give them our data and they make chains that fit us better, chains to imprison man. I created bathwater as an answer to help us break these chains. If they can't track us, they can't control us. If they can't control us, we might be able to resurrect our future. Maybe in some small way, it will make their control less and our freedom more, and help us to wake the fuck up. He motions back to the ocean and yells at the camera, wake the fuck up. What is bathwater? This is the part I want people to really pay attention to. It was a computer program he wrote that every tech giant out there wanted desperately. They were willing to do anything to get it, and not because they could use it, but because they didn't want anybody to ever be able to use it. Because the entire point, they wanted it buried because the entire point of this software was that it was going to contaminate all the data that they were collecting on people with erroneous information, and that made it all worthless. If some of it's contaminated, then none of it's any good, and you're forced to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's why he called it bathwater. It's an excellent show, and I'm not convinced that's a half bad idea, so I'm throwing it out there for our hacktivist and programmer friends. There's another interesting thing that was brought up during this series, and this comes from Hand of God Season 2, Episode 9. The mayor walks into an office of one of the tech giants who's got candles burning, and he's got this fancy chair that he has, in between standing and laying. And the mayor walks into his office and he says, does that work? That's the Alexander Graham Bell trick, right? Trying to brainstorm on the edge between awake and asleep. And then the tech giant tells him it's called Hypnagogia. Now, this is a word that I've never heard before, so I'm going to give you some of the more standard definitions per Wikipedia. It says Hypnagogia is between awake and asleep, the borderland, or some people refer to it as dreamlets. According to Wikipedia, Edgar Allan Poe referred to fancies he experienced, quote, only when I am on the brink of sleep with the consciousness that I am so. According to Wikipedia, Charles Dickens also referred to this in his novel Oliver Twist. He provided an elaborate description of it, of the hypnagogic state, in chapter 34 of Oliver Twist. Now, this helps me segue into something that I think is important to explain, because a lot of people are new. And James and I used to do many, many, many radio shows together. And it's been 2, maybe 3 years since we've done one. And I've had a lot of new people come that aren't familiar with James. And even now there are people that I know in real life who get very uncomfortable when I mention James because he is very, very controversial. But when I use that word, what I'm really saying is he challenges long-held beliefs in a way that people find difficult. But that's okay. If they can be challenged, maybe they should be challenged. So something that I experienced quite often in my life, I refer to as the lucky guesser phenomenon. I just call it LGP for short. Maybe it's related to hypnagogia, maybe it's not, I don't really know. But to give you a couple examples of what I mean. The first radio show I did was in 2009. And when I was doing that radio show, I was explaining to the host that when I was writing the book, there was a psychic that I was writing about whose real name was Annie. And because I wasn't sure if she wanted me to use her real name, I had picked a pseudonym for her that I thought was as far away from Annie as you could get. I picked Margaret. So when I was nearing the end of the book, I approached her and I said, hey, I've been using this name Margaret for you, but if it's okay if I can use your real name and even send people to you, are you okay with that? She said to me, do you know that Margaret was almost my real name? She said my mother and father had an argument about it because her father wanted to name her after his mother, but in the end, her mother won and they named her Annie. Now, right after I got done explaining that during that radio show, we were on to a new subject, and I was telling the host, let's pretend you're and it was going to be an astrological sign. So I'm like, it doesn't matter what I pick. I said, let's pretend you're a Libra. And then I started talking, continuing, and he interrupted me and he said, I am a Libra. So I just said, are you? And I chuckled and I kept talking. Then, this is really a funny one. A few years ago, my family and I were binge watching some Netflix series over the weekend, and it was really good. And it was Sunday night, and we just finished one that ended at a really good spot. But the guys had to get up early in the morning, so I was trying to calm them into watching one more. And I didn't have a cell phone back then, and we have this huge couch. I'm in the middle, they're on the ends. We're all just kind of spread out and relaxed watching this show. And so my husband says, he looks at his phone, which I can't see, and there are no clocks in my house. He looks at his phone and he says, we'll watch another episode if you can tell me exactly what time it is. So I thought about it, and two numbers popped into my head. One was 12:07, one was 11:38. I almost said 12:07, but I thought, I'll just 11:38. So my son says, "Oh my God." And because I never thought I would get it right. And I said, "Did I get it right?" And my son blurts out to his father, he says, "Do you see, that's how she cheats at Monopoly." So, of course, I don't cheat at Monopoly. But this kind of thing has happened to me so many times. And I think a lot of people are familiar with the first book that I wrote before I met James. Maybe not, because it hasn't been available for a long time. And I don't talk about it much anymore. But I want people to know, why did I inevitably gravitate towards James, and why I felt like I really kind of had no other choice. The hypnagogia thing, I brought that up because it's been about 13 years ago now, but I went through a period for, it was approximately 9 months, where I was learning things in my dreams. And what I ultimately learned was, we've done all of this before. Man has self-destructed 6 times. I could find evidence for 6 times when I looked, but during my dreams, the number of times wasn't, part of the equation. It was why it happens. And I learned that it hasn't just happened over and over again, but that we were doing it again and almost at the end of that road. And before I met James, I thought I was literally the only person on the planet that knew this. But still, it was difficult, but let me just get through a couple of things here. What I learned primarily is that these episodes are the result of man's misapplication of knowledge, and this generally becomes the destruction of intelligent design, the destruction of creation, the weaponization of creation, where nature gets turned in on itself. This kind of thing is the cause. I knew that the moon was artificially constructed, that we went to the moon, but we didn't get there in rockets. Another interesting thing that I talked about in that first interview is that this was back when everybody was saying, oh, we're all going to die in 2012. And they had Ed Dames on all the big shows saying the kill shot was coming. And I was telling people, look, this is nonsense. None of this is going to happen. But you have to understand that the sun is reacting to us, what we're doing down here. So the kill shot doesn't have to happen. This is something that we could prevent. I wrote a lot about the conscious mind and the subconscious mind not communicating with each other, getting around this impairment through dreams, because that worked for me. The further back in time you go, the more advanced we were, not the other way around. So you see humanity is being misled, because every time they find any evidence of a high-tech civilization, they automatically shift that to an alien, right? Aliens did that because they don't want you to know who you were and where you came from and what you're really capable of. And I also wrote about man starting out on Mars, having destroyed it, and then come to Earth. That was before I met James. James came out a few months later for the first time publicly on the Kevin Smith show, at which point Tors contacted me at a forum that I was on, and she said, you need to go listen to what this guy is saying, because it's very similar to what you've said. And when I heard James explain who he was, I couldn't get past it. I thought, this is just too weird. I don't care if the guy is saying the same things. I just can't get past it, because basically what James was saying is, yes, You are on the verge of doing it again, and that's why I'm here. And oh, by the way, I'm not from here. And when I say not from here, I don't mean not from Las Vegas. So I just couldn't get past it. But as time went on, I really kind of liked the idea of not being the only person on the earth who understood what was happening because it's not good. I went back and I listened to more of his shows, and I thought, I really need to contact this person. I need to get a sense for myself if he's telling the truth. And we've been very good friends ever since, and we've done several shows together. Now, the lucky guesser phenomenon, there is something else that I want to discuss very briefly, and this is another book that I wrote before I met James. I met James in 2011. And these are things that James doesn't even know, to my knowledge, because you have to understand that, yes, we're friends, and yes, I wrote 2 books, but the second one was fiction. And when people are awake and doing research to try to better understand the reality of their reality, they don't normally turn to fiction. I turned to fiction because there was so much resistance to what I was saying, because you have to remember this was in, the end of 2009, before the Gulf of Mexico, before Fukushima. Reality just hadn't been persistent long enough for people to really get that they're surrounded by the truth of what I'm saying. It wasn't that obvious. It's different now. So I went with fiction because I thought, well, maybe this is an easier way to kind of slip in the truth. And a lot of people do that. It's very common. So I wrote this book. Now, again, I think I'm making all of this up. I think that I'm just pulling things out of the air and it's fiction. That's what I think, okay? And that's the problem with LPG, the lucky guesser phenomenon, is, I guess, maybe like remote viewing. You don't know that you've done it unless you get feedback. If Annie had not told me that story, I would not know about Margaret actually almost being her name. If my husband didn't tell me that I got the time right, I wouldn't have known. Without the feedback, you just don't know. So I wrote this story that had 2 different timelines. Humanity had been split into 2 different timelines, and the split was caused by the aberrant use of technology. There were a group of people, a very small group of people, that I referred to in the book as simals, because for some reason, this small segment of the population could remember both timelines simultaneously. And specifically, they remembered people who weren't here anymore. One timeline was doing better, and that was the point of the 2 timelines, or so I thought when I wrote it, was, you can show the contrast of where we are versus where we could and even should be based on the choices we've made. In the timeline that was doing better, they were more agrarian, I think you could say. They were using some advanced technology, but it was very, very elegant and beautiful. It wasn't this dirty, clunky metal. It was just something so completely different. And the people in this timeline were working with the extended community because they had this massive undertaking, because they remembered people that weren't there anymore. They wanted to find a way to get people into the other timeline because they knew what was happening over there, and they wanted to try to make it better. They wanted to help these people overcome it the way they had. And these people were teaching their children how to build solar systems. so 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 imagine this. So James and I have been friends for years. We're doing radio shows. I wrote this book in 2010, and then in 2013, another friend and colleague of ours, Myron MacDonald, sees this article about Napoleon and how these French scientists wanted to do some type of experiment on basically on his corpse to determine, what caused his small stature. Was it a pituitary problem? What was it? And really the whole story is kind of strange because there's no soft tissue left to test. And from what I understand, Napoleon wasn't actually that short. He was about 5'7". So it's kind of a weird story. But the really bizarre thing is, one of the scientists was rubbing his head around the inside of Napoleon's skull, and he found something, and it was a microchip. And not just any microchip, but a microchip that's being made today. And so Myron asks James, is this a true story? And that's when James says, yes, that's what caused a split in the timeline. So this kind of thing happens, and I get that it's weird, and maybe James and I are a sad pair. I don't know. But these are things, I can't overlook this. I can't walk away. So I get that it's strange, but I think reality is stranger than fiction. And in that sense, I think it's also far more beautiful. With all of that said, James, I wanted people to know why I do shows with you. Yes, I think you are the real deal. I really do. Other people are just going to have to make up their own mind. But I also encourage people to understand that humanity has been kept in this bubble of ignorance that's just grotesque. It's appalling. And without somebody from the outside coming in and telling us what the outside really looks like, how would we ever know? Dreams, maybe a glimpse here, a glimpse there, but without feedback, are you ever really going to know? I don't think so. So, welcome back, James. It's been a long time since your voice has graced the airwaves. How are you?
All right.
So, James has been out of circulation for a while, recovering from an accident that he had. And so, how are you coming along with that, James?
Oh, very well. Since I started getting fresh food to eat, which you don't get in an institution like the VA.
Yeah, really. So many of us are so glad that Trump won for a variety of reasons, but one is to overhaul the VA. The horror stories that James has to tell of his time in there are really something else. So we're really glad that you're home and back, James. So, James, let's start with the six previous versions or lineages of man all having miscarried. And what would a successful birth look like or mean in terms of the end of being quarantined on Earth? What's really going on here? What's the cycle that we're trapped in?
Well, the cycle is that you have a caste system that has persisted through all those lineages, and it always comes about to get to the extent where secret societies coalesce under creating their own god or sublimating some monstrous cause, which means that they're above everyone else and have the right of power of life and death over them. And they begin to accelerate bad medicine, bad technology, creation of war, and paint themselves in the corner. And it gets to a point where the only way that these damaged minds can see getting out of that corner is to turn on the jets of the gas stove in the kitchen and blow the house up with them in it. And that's what they're actually doing now. They are talking about starting with World War III, and you have 5 nations that have the ability to destroy the earth. And if you really think there's such a thing as limited exchange, with they have the weapons to do this, then you don't know anything about history, because the losing nation or nations will throw everything they've got rather than be taken over or lose to a victor. And that's been proven true in this lineage, and it is it's not rectifiable. People lose themselves so easily to struggles, and it's a province of the split consciousness, and it's a province of the vast triggering education that are giving these children. I mean, they are imprinted with triggers. They can be brought to a trance state by some of the strangest forms of inducement you can imagine, and you see that in California right now.
That's very true, James. I want to save that conversation for later because I really want to dive deep into it and provide some of the backstory that led up to that moment. But in terms of the previous lineages of man, I think it's interesting. I heard someone say recently, I think it was Cliff High of the Webbot Report actually, say that so much is going to come out in the very near future about our past that we're going to have a new term for our real history, and right now we have terms
Oh,
for
yeah.
the different ages. And I think actually you've already coined the term that we should use, and that's the lineage. So rather than saying in the Pleias period, we would say during the third lineage, during this period of the third lineage, or the first lineage, or the sixth lineage. Now, James, just so the audience knows, James claims that this is the seventh and final try. And I go with that because In my own research, I found references to 6 previous lineages. One is the Native American story of the fifth son. And then there was a couple, Jerry and Kathy Wills, who were explorers of sorts, who would go to remote destinations and archaeological sites and record what they found. And they went to Peru once, and there were these 6 large stones, very large rectangular stones that were fit very neatly together. And supposedly the lore was that each one of these stones represented a previous lineage of man. So Mark Snyder asked this of you in the last show you did with him, and I thought it was a great question, so I want to ask it again, especially in light of you bringing up World War III. How many times in the past did we destroy ourselves with nuclear war? Because even today we have evidence of it with the green glass in the desert, that this has happened before. How many times did we destroy ourselves that way, James?
It wasn't twice, and it wasn't like what we're talking about today as far as nuclear weapons. The problem has always been that the caste system has a predilection to put the wrong people in decision-making roles. These are people that will service the powers that be or the elite, and they'll do it to the detriment of everyone else, which eventually will mean the earth itself. And
Yes.
in this respect, they're weapons that will attack nature. And of course, the idea being that the attack on nature is just the nature surrounding the enemy, but it never stops at that.
That's right. Eventually, which is happening now and has been happening for some time, they turn nature into the weapon, which is extremely grotesque.
Well, that's what they're doing with Horak today.
That's right. And chemtrails and vaccines and GMOs and all kinds of other things. This is something that I used to talk about a lot before we met, James, is that people's ignorance of intelligent design and how things happen, how the system works, is such a detriment to their ability to really use their own free will in their own interests. Because if you don't have good knowledge, you can really easily be conned into working against yourself under the false pretenses of doing the opposite. And we have a lot of that happening, especially with GMOs and vaccines. And in that situation, people become conned into participating in their own demise out of ignorance. And something that I think we tried very hard over the years to use as a good example of that was chemtrails and how an atmosphere is created. You know, you've got all these people out there protesting global warming, which is a myth. It's a lie. It's a con. And you've got people that are saying, oh, the sun is changing. The sun is turning white and it's cooking us. But that's not what's happening. And they don't know that because they don't understand how an atmosphere is actually created. We're at a point now where so many natural systems, they're killing nature to kill us. And if people think that's really far out, I remind them again that even the Romans did this. You know, they used to call it vestatio, which is the purposeful destruction of one's homeland and environment to ensure subjugation. They used to poison the wells. They used to salt the earth. But now we've graduated, instead of salting the earth, which was done to curse the enemy's future generations, now we use things like depleted uranium munitions, which, as Rosalie Bertell pointed out, is the equivalent of flinging radioactive waste at your enemies, whose babies will be deformed for generations to come. So the mentality never changes. And you know, you hear people say, well, technology makes the world smaller. I think we've gotten to the point where it's actually just given psychopathy greater reach. What do you think?
Well, I see technology today sublimating itself that it would be a god. Recently listened to a video of a CEO of a company that had the only company that's actually made a quantum computer. And before he was through, he had gotten into the bazaar, and what he was trying to do is the same thing that they are trying to do at CERN. They want to mechanize the spiritual. They're aware the spiritual exists, and that with their frame of reference and their lack of a moral core, they don't have access or control over it. So if they can mechanize it, they can control the mechanics that mechanizes it, and that's a quantum computer or that's CERN or whatever. And of course, if they can sell this notion, then they've overcome religion. They can use religion the same way that they use mechanics to deal with people that have any ethical religious background that would oppose them. So what you really do have is you have a metaphor for the apocalypse, not a biblical one, but you have a metaphor for it. And that's what CERN is all about. That is what this fellow's ideal in creating a quantum computer is all about. And I poo-poo the whole value system behind such things because they are so problematic, they create their own horror. And that's what the quantum computer is going to do. When you realize that the processor has to be cooled at absolute zero, and imagine the energy that that takes. That when you have such realities as this, then you step back and you wonder, is this thing valuable enough to deserve all this sacrifice? And it's not.
And of course, this is how they always operate. They sell this technology as, it's going to be this wondrous advancement for the entire human race. But meanwhile, it really has a nefarious purpose, but they've got to sell it to get the funding for it.
I stress over and over again something that people I don't think realize, you am I stressing? I say no one will ever see the face of God. These monsters presume they will. And of course, everyone is interested. There was even a Star Trek episode where the pursuit of God was the expedition into deep space. Well, they ended up no better off than they were before. And of course, they realized that the whole idea in the long run was a delusion. And of course, that can be interpreted by the atheist as meaning you give up there is a God, or else they would have found. No. Mortals, even off Earth, are capable of corruption. And God is not, by definition. And that is why they'll never see the face of God. Now, you and I both know there's something that has designed planets and moons and kept things going from self-destructing, beauty in nature, perfection even. You talk about a designer. And I think that anybody that has had a spiritual experience knows that there's something beyond the perceived reality that's not relativistic, but that has to do with something beyond this lifetime. There are people that get little incidents of that. Now, it's a little bit more to those with a unified consciousness because they have access to the collective consciousness and genetic memory. But if you don't, you'll only occasionally have experiences where you connect with the collective consciousness or genetic memory. And people have those from time to time, and some of those things are recorded and documented. Now, they're left as a mystery, but they wouldn't be if people realized what they're dealing with.
James, I want to give people some backstory, and I want to start with the moon. Recently I was thinking to myself, why did I write a book in which people were teaching their children to build solar systems? I mean, it was fiction, but what was the impetus for that? Because while I was writing, it just seemed like, well, that's just the natural progression of things. And I thought, maybe it was the moon, because the existence of the moon and what NASA has known for a very long time about the moon. And there's a brief essay on my blog about this called 11 Things NASA Knows About the Moon, if people want to go look it up. I'm not going to read it here. But the existence of the moon is telling us that creating something on that scale, building something on that scale, is not only possible, but it's already been done. That's what the moon is and represents. So maybe you could just tell us again very quickly where the moon came from, because I want to get into some of the anomalies, especially as it applies to, this idea of the virtual reality or the hologram theory. You've got even people like Elon Musk talking about how we're not living in a real reality, whatever that means by his definition. And you have always said from the beginning that we are living in a partially manifested reality. So I want to try to kind of marry those two things together, explain the split consciousness, and then we can get into, there's a fellow that's videotaping the moon that actually shows what looks like the moon re-rendering itself, which is the most bizarre thing to watch. So what is the moon? And in terms of the design, in terms of humans designing their own solar system, moving the moon here, what does that mean for us?
Well, the moon is a way for peoples that were in fear of their own system collapsing to go into deep space with all the resources that they needed to reestablish at some level of cultural technology that they had originally. Of course, when you do that, you can't go at warp speeds. You have to go at a speed less than the speed of light. So it'll take you, in the case of your ancestors, it would take you 300 years to go to the planet in the system that they presumed would be most hospitable to their immediate use. And so they could survive their cultures and replenish the technology with the resources that was required. And the moon has those resources because it was built into them at the time that they constructed it. The moon has a superstructure. The Earth has a superstructure. Every planet has a moon, has a superstructure. And the metal that is used is the same metal that is in many of the craft that are used that are capable of going into space, where they're going to be bombarded with cosmic particles and X-ray radiation that would kill you if you did not have a metal that could be ionized and create a situation where if your craft turned at right angles going at speeds over, say, 30,000 miles, and I mean that it would tear everything in the craft apart. When you can ionize that metal, you can have an environment that you can adjust to be hospitable and duplicate the environment that you developed in, that you lived in. I talk about some of the things that we've seen in the sun occurring, and there's one of them where there are members of the extended community that are making that metal because they were going to create some things in our own solar system that they felt needed to be done. Right now, there are a number of things going on that people have noticed in Saturn, and that people have noticed in Jupiter. And, they are beginning to speculate. Even National Geographic did a video on the Great Barrier Reef, and they speculated at the end of it that there were beings, probably intelligent beings, under the ice of the moons of Jupiter, which, there just might be. And what they would look like and how they would deal with, a habitat below ice and that could be done. It was an amazing video, and, they had made it in conjunction with Disney, of all people. And it was the first time that they had used so many deep-sea bathyspheres that it was a first-time event. And they had 2 or 3 different ships. So they'd gone down into the trenches and had seen some spectacular things. And then in one exposure, they actually showed the edges of the city of the sea that is there, that's trying to make up for the Corexit that BP's dumping on the Great Barrier Reef. And the result was spectacular. But after I started talking about it, that little bit of exposure disappeared from the documentary.
I know because I watched it and it wasn't in there. It was done by James Cameron, the same guy who did the Avatar.
When you see the documentary I saw, when their camera is moving across the wall of this trench where the cities of the sea are, it hits the red, the beautiful red of the cities of the sea, And all of a sudden, it's off. And then something else comes up. It's real interesting, but after I started talking about it, they removed it entirely. And
Yeah, they did. Like I said, because I went and watched it, and what you're saying should stand out like a sore thumb. I mean,
oh,
this
it
bright
does.
red,
It does.
yeah, it
It's
just
not
wasn't there.
beautiful. I don't know if you've ever seen where strychnine is operating with minerals, growing rubies on boulders and everything in Colorado and so forth. It's a beautiful red. I mean, there's no red exactly like it, and they try to reproduce it. But strychnine has a redness that's quite beautiful. But when it's involved with these other minerals, they created a dye in the Middle Ages when monks were doing their illumination for books. This dye was so beautiful that they would make it, but it was deadly. So if you licked your fingers when you were turning a page, you might die. And strychnine is extremely horrible way of death.
Hmm. I think it's important, James, that we try to help bring our fellow man up to speed, not just with our situation, our real situation on planet Earth, but also our relationship to the extended community, what they have already done for us, what they won't do for us, and why, and also why our survival depends on their assistance and why we must do our part to receive that assistance. So let's talk about that. The cities of the sea were a gift. Who were
Yeah.
they from, and why explain why they were here?
The cities of the sea were made with genetics and the mineral.
By the
We
extended community.
know
No, who made those?
EMVs.
The EMVs made those.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's definitely a new perspective on the EMVs, which we haven't talked about yet, and we will. I want everybody to know we will because it's so beautiful. So the EMVs made these. Was this at your behest or?
Yes.
Okay, so you saw what was happening here, and you know that we're in a dire situation, and most people have no clue what's happening. So you took it upon yourself to give us something that would buy us more time. Where were the cities of the sea placed?
In both oceans.
The
And
Pacific and the Atlantic?
they can move, they can be airborne. When they left the Pacific Ocean, there were a number of pilots that saw them, and there were some videos made of what they saw.
You know, that's very true. And we've covered this before. I'm not going to go back and pull those links up again for people. They can go back through old shows. But if I remember right, James, you said that the ones in the Pacific were put there because of plutonium dumping. Is that right?
No, no, the Pacific Ocean was such a breadbasket. It has provided so much of the world's food that when certain things started happening during one of the lineages, that's when this was done. The cities of the sea were engineered, and of course, it was done in the Atlantic, and it was in the Atlantic where the Atlantic trough where they were dumping the plutonium in barrels that had begun leaking after the fifth year. The cities of the sea could actually ingest the plutonium and render it harmless, and that's what they were doing.
But
There's
they
a
left after Fukushima. They did leave, and we've
yes,
talked about that before in radio shows. Now, these are living organisms that you refer to as cities of the sea. They're not buildings, they're beings whose purpose and function was to purify the oceans. After Fukushima, because we did nothing and still have done nothing to mitigate the damage to the ocean it's causing, they left. And during that event, there are photos of pilots seeing these glowing red lights rise up out of the ocean. And there are other stories that say people saw a craft take them away. I don't know if that part's true or
but
fanciful.
they don't need craft. There's something else. It's hard to even give you an idea about what they are, but they are a form of life that is task driven like the EMVs and beautiful in what they do and how they can be related to. But I've said whenever they leave the Atlantic, kiss your ass goodbye.
I know you do. I want other people to know you do. I want other people to know about it. I mean, my God, do you have any idea out of the billions of people on this planet, how many even know what we're talking about?
And
And they deserve to know.
there's so many innocent children. Uh,
Yes.
I can't even talk about it without getting emotional.
I know. I'm the same way. I don't get too far into that, especially as a mother. Let me ask you something that's kind of off topic, but I've been meaning to ask you about it for so long. I don't want to forget. You've mentioned in other radio shows, and this is another thing that we have to keep into perspective, that there have been 6 previous lineages of man on the earth that were here for very long spans of time. Then things are rendered asunder, everything starts over. The EMVs are involved in that process of kind of cleansing and getting everything ready for the next lineage again. But the earth has been damaged, severely damaged through all of these lineages, the way it's been treated. And you've mentioned before that the EMVs have an operation in Utah because the earth was cracked in the previous lineage. Is that right?
What determines the stability of a living planet? A planet that has the plant life, animal life, the profusion of life that the earth has is the mantle. The mantle is the secret for that health that's required. The mantle, of course, is like a vast ring of magma, and it moves. And it's very important that in the mantle that the magma is distributed in a balanced way. Now, when the cores amalgamated and formed what they in jest call corium, they continued their fission and created new forms of radioactive material, isotopes that had never even been seen before on Earth.
Yes, we're talking about Fukushima for those listening. Once Fukushima happened, yes.
And once the isotope tritium became available in the atmosphere, they knew then that the cores were creating a bigger and bigger problem. Now, they have hit the mantle and they have caused a disproportionate distribution of the magma. And you've got an increase in volcanoes, earthquakes, and other things that are associated with that. And the EMV operation in Utah has helped that situation from getting too far out of hand as much as it can, and has also held the planet together by the way in which energy is taken, oil and gas, and the vast cavities that is left that they fill with seawater and does not serve the same cushioning effect that oil will. All of these things have perplexed the planet, and in the 6 former lineages, there were even a couple of times when it was even worse. So they've been there through 3 extinctions. They have done a tremendous job of holding things together. And, you know, that everyone, including extended community, awaits a time whenever humanity here gets it together enough to stop some of the madness, to close these reactors and shut them down, to put their cores and their radioactive materials in a sarcophagus that will contain them, and then stop this war making and weapons making and use the resources to make life better for the people. Then they will get help. I mean, there's nothing that the extended community or anyone from out there would have you do that you shouldn't do for yourselves anyway.
I agree. Of course, the problem for most people is that they have absolutely no idea any of this is actually happening. Here it is, 6 years after the Fukushima Daiichi plant multiple core reactor meltdown. Nothing has been done. Daily, for 6 years, we've been getting stories about mass die-offs in the Pacific Ocean. Absolutely nothing is being done to stop.
The hoard out media, that's what I call them. It's just like the public school system. What's important is what they avoid teaching.
That's right. Which is designed primarily.
You can take and make things interesting to children where they'll eat it up, just like they can do with languages. You can do all kinds of things. What is their impetus? They have curriculums, and they don't let these teachers teach out of these curriculums. Therefore, they can't inspire these children because it's the imagination of the teacher that inspires the children, not what's on a damn piece of paper. And what's on the paper is hideous. I mean, there's so many things that human decency would find repugnant about these curriculums. And how
Oh, absolutely. Especially
yeah,
after Common Core was introduced. It's pedophilic grooming is built into the curriculum. And one of the architects of it admitted publicly, now I'm paraphrasing, but you'll get the gist of it. He said, well, the disparity between the classes and education, the only way we could close the gap is instead of raising the others up, we're just going to push everyone down to the same level.
well,
He admitted that. That was the purpose of it.
it's relativism.
Yeah.
And of course, you and I had an exposure. We were on this show, remember?
Yes, I remember.
And all of a sudden, relativism became the subject, and it disgusted both of us. And I wish we both had just walked off.
And
But
we made an agreement that next time we would, if it ever happens again.
Well, we'd never deal with that host again.
No, absolutely not.
And so he got very ornery over that because he expected us to be understanding.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't now. Yeah.
That's what the left wing has bought into is relativism, because to sell collectivism today, every country, including China and Russia, that has experienced communism, which communism is relativistic. Collectivism is relativistic because it is not obedient to the nature of man. Everybody's miserable living under it. It destroys itself. It eats itself alive. And that's proven over and over again.
James, I do want to get into that, but I want to finish with the moon before we move on. I don't want to lose people over the moon. I interrupted your train of thought. What I was going to ask you is if the Grand Canyon had something to do with this crack that you were talking about, because I've flown over it enough times in an airplane that that's exactly what it looks like, is a gigantic crack. So I always meant to ask you if that was a related phenomenon or not.
You can take and do a lot of things with water and erosion, but create a Grand Canyon?
Yeah, I've never bought that. I mean, when you see it from the air, it looks exactly like a gigantic crack in the earth that goes on for miles.
The question that I've always wondered that these geologists never ask is why the Grand Canyon when everywhere else on Earth, except the Grand Gorge in Africa, everywhere else on Earth, when these rivers are going through rock and soil or whatever, they'll meander. When you look at the river, the Colorado, when you look at it in the area of the Grand Canyon, why isn't that occurring? It doesn't occur there. And it cuts through rock, and in some cases, rock much harder than sandstone, and it has never changed course.
Yes, and the proximity of the EMVs, I thought, was interesting to the Grand Canyon also.
Yeah, well, the Grand Canyon has been a subterfuge and served very well as a subterfuge for a number of people off Earth. And they have found some of their dwellings there. One of them they found even had extremely advanced battery salts, which they've used in a probe. And it's been out there traveling now for years, and supposedly they thought those batteries would wear out by now, and it's still sending information back on what it is digitally photographing. So, it's gone so much further than they ever thought it would. And, of course, what they're getting back, they have no idea what it is. I mean, they stumble around trying to define what they're seeing. And they're not hitting a bullseye on that by any means because they have no frame of reference. I mean, they're seeing things that they cannot find any way of defining. And that's the way it is. But, of course, it's not a matter that physics changes. It's a matter that they don't understand a lot of the physical properties and laws well enough here to grasp what's going on out there.
Yeah, and there are people that really like it that way. Well, let's finish with the moon, James, in terms of, now, you went on the Kevin Smith show in I think September of 2010. And the name of the show, it's on YouTube if people look it up, is Kevin Smith Show with James Horak, Fungus on the Moon. And many UFO researchers for years have speculated that man is quarantined, that we aren't allowed to
Yeah.
leave Earth, and you refer to us as earthbounds, and you've explained why. Until we overcome our aberrancy, we're not welcomed anywhere else. And if I was out there, I wouldn't want us out there either, and that's the truth. So I think that's another wonderful sign that intelligent design has a wisdom that it imparts to other elements that appreciate it. We aren't there yet, but we're trying to get there.
Dr.
I
Burton
believe
had images of that fungus on a rover, on tripods that they were putting equipments on, and it was just eating it up.
this was
People,
how we were kicked off the moon, so people know, because we skipped that part.
yeah,
Man was kicked off the moon and Mars, right? Both planets, because they were trying to weaponize space. Exporting
yeah,
their insanity into space is not going to be tolerated. And I thought that people would find this interesting. There are 3 different quotes I picked up from this show. 2 are from Kevin and 1 is from you. And I'd like to read these very quickly because I've always believed that we did go to the moon because we know enough about the moon that we've clearly been there. We clearly didn't get there in rocket ships, and people have to understand that we know there are other people out in the universe because there are pictures of them all over the planet, and some date back to 10,000 years, and we didn't have JPL or Ames. Those companies didn't exist. We know we've been visited for a very long time. So I thought this was interesting. So Kevin said, now this is that same show, Fungus on the Moon from 2010. At the 33-minute mark, Kevin says, and I had just mentioned this workshop that was at Los Alamos in 1998, and the importance of this, folks, is the line in the notes that came out of that meeting that used to be posted online. I don't know if you can still find them or not, but it said the drilling technology they had decided to use on Mars was, quote, the proven successful Russian lunar drilling technology. So there are tidbits here and there that prove we've been to these planets. They just aren't coming clean with the population. And that is, I think, because the elites think that they're going to be able to go hide from what they've done. And we'll get into that more in a minute. Now, you said, this is interesting. At the 46:28 mark, Kevin says he wants to talk about when humans were told to leave the moon, by whom and why. And then he refers to former communications director for the Apollo missions, Maurice Chatelain, who wrote in a book that we were kicked off the moon. So I went and looked up his books last week. He wrote 2 books. One was called Our Ancestors Came from the Moon, and the second one he co-authored called Our Cosmic Ancestors. And for people who are listening to this for the first time and thinking, oh my God, what are they talking about? James and I, years ago, I think in 2012, did a very long show together called A New Cosmology to Address Cosmic Anomaly, Lifting the Veil, where we went all the way back through our ancestors having come here on the moon from another system. They went to Mars first, then they came here. It's really, really a wonderful story, and it answers so many questions. But I want to read something from an article that I found here, if you could give me just a minute, because I did some digging. Because an article came out recently. Now, this was in 2010. James was telling people that there was a fungus, that the extended community released a fungus that eats our metal to get us off of these planets. It doesn't hurt people, it only hurts the metal. Recently, I think last month, another article came out about this fungus, but they put some spin on it. So I thought that I would read this article because it's very interesting. I will, of course, include this link when the show is uploaded. I'll include links to most of this. Now, this was written in 2000. It's on rents.com. It says, Life exists in space. Strange fungus overruns Mir space station. It was written by Gareth Cook of the Boston Globe. I'm only going to read a little bit of it, but I think people will find it interesting. The history books will never record it, but life in outer space was discovered about 12 years ago by a Russian cosmonaut as he was gazing out a window of the station Mir. Squinting to set his sights on the passing Earth below, the space explorer instead focused on a thick living mat that had made its way up the window's hard quartz surface, nearly obliterating any view. A microbiologist, Natalia Novikova, eventually identified the growth as an aggressive space fungus. And since then, she's had her hands full examining the various forms of fungi found growing aboard the ship. The aging Mir, it turns out, is nearly overrun with the stuff. Visitors have found numerous fungal patches with hues between green and black, feeding behind control panels, slowly digesting the ship's air conditioner, communications unit, and myriad other surfaces. Pull out an insulation panel on Mir and you'll probably find fungus. Scientists are discovering that biodegradation, the term used to describe the microbial damage to materials, is far greater a problem than previously thought. So this is a very real phenomenon. This is not something that you've made up.
No, and people have always said this, that in retrospect, you're going to see everything that I talk about is true. It may not be in the next year or so, but you will.
You know what's so funny? I mean, this has already happened. It happens quite often. About a month ago, I think his show is called The Dark Journalist. He had Carmen Bolter on, the pyramid expert, right? And it was this groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting revelation about Akhenaten. Well, that revelation didn't come from Carmen Bolter a month ago. That revelation came from James Horak years ago. That video was online. A lot of things that you've said would happen have happened. A lot of things that you have explained have been proven out to be true, and I think that it just gives you more credibility. But I think one of the reasons that the ufology community dares not speak your name is because so much of what you have to say doesn't just challenge their beliefs and the beliefs that they've made a lot of money selling, it disintegrates them. Now, when I met James, the first book I wrote, I took it off the market because when I met James, I realized there were some things I got very wrong, and all I care about is the truth. My selling millions of books isn't going to prevent the sixth or seventh miscarriage of the human race. That doesn't matter to me. What I care about is my independence, my individuality, my free will, and my survival in a world that actually is worth living in. And how do we get there? So it's sad, but so much has happened, James, between the time you came out publicly in 2010 and now, that I think that people have matured a lot. And, the idea that this may be our last go, it's not hard to sell anymore. So I would hope that people would be more open-minded and try to get it right rather than protect a reputation that isn't going to save them either.
Well, I've been amazed in the last few months because I wanted to start a project because I had things I wanted to do. And this project involves a great deal of potential. And I tried to get in touch with the people that could help me get it off the ground. And I mean, it doesn't matter what I say or what I offer or what proof that I can produce, nobody's interested. And I'm not talking about something that is a few $1 million worth of this or $1 million worth of that. I'm talking about something that'll pan out to increase the GNP of a section of this country tremendously. I don't know whether or not I'm just blacklisted and everybody is running that hears my name or what, because every time that I've ever been confronted with a challenge or whatever, I've met it. And, I have a number of people on my wall, and some of them every once in a while will get ornery with me. But it's never over issues. It's never over details or anything that I can lay down in front of them that'll, solve an anomaly or that will put things together that they hadn't connected. But, it's like today I had to delete a person off my wall, and that's the first time in years, year and a half. I've had to do that, but he was deriding Trump. I'm standing up and I give my argument, and then he says, well, anybody ought to know that Trump is this or that. And he said a couple of things that are totally unjustified. So I deleted his comments, and I removed him from my friends list. And then I explained why I did, because there's some people that probably seen that. And I always explain, if you want to debate me, I'm not going to unfriend you over that. But when you have nonsense and you have to resort to the name calling, can't meet me with my counter assertion or my part of the argument or whatever, you don't have any reason to be there. And I certainly don't have any reason for you to be there.
Yes.
So, that's what you find in these people. And the left has become like that. They have become so agenda driven that they call people fascist, and they're the ones that are acting like fascists. They don't want people voicing their opinions, and they'll attack them. That's fascist.
The arrogance of these people is astonishing. I've never been a political animal myself. It's only been recently that I've been paying more attention to world events and politicians because of the corruption. It's just so over the top.
It forces you to have to be political.
It does. You can't honestly change the world for the better and ignore that, because in so many veins, that's the epicenter of people's trauma. And so we've got to root it out, which is why we voted for Trump. He promised to restore the rule of law, and that has to come first, because all of the other dastardly things that happened were a result of losing that one first.
The one thing that bites me more than any other is that it is people with political power that are using that to indulge the greatest sin on earth, and that is pedophilia. And
that's right.
They are protected. They're insulated because there's so many of them. And you begin to wonder, do these people go into politics to get this kind of authority or power so that's what they can do? Or is this something they acquired taste for by people that are corrupting them in ways where they can use this as blackmail? So I have never come to a conclusion one way or the other. It may be some of this and some of that.
Yeah, I think it's probably both. I think you've got people who have a predisposition for it, and I think other people might imbibe a little too much. Maybe their drinks are spiked when they're out at the Grove during their cremation of care ceremony, and, it's ugly. It's a very ugly thing.
They give themselves away with that metaphor, cremation of care.
They absolutely do. And do people not remember the Olympics? Do you remember that god awful? It was satanic, the giant dead baby and the reaper. It was so in your face. And, there is a Luciferian agenda playing out across the globe.
Yeah.
There just is.
Well, they have this belief, and it's one of the Talmud, that if they come out and they tell you the worst of what they're going to do, and you don't believe it because it's so incredible, that now they're justified. They have cleaned their karma, and they can go ahead in full volition to do whatever it is they do, whether it is sacrifice babies and drink their blood and sell the meat to McDonald's, or what. There is a Talmudic rabbi that has come online and said this, and then at the end he says, but you're too stupid and too incredulous to believe this, so I can say it right into your face. That's what he says, to paraphrase it. But, my memory is merciful. I really don't want to remember a lot of what I see and how it comes out. So, I may have a poor recollection of it because I don't want to see it. It's so disgusting.
I used to get that a lot from people when I first started doing these shows, James, and this was primarily from the New Agers that would bring this up. And really, we should talk about the similarities between the New Age community and the Luciferian community. So don't let me forget to do that after this. But they would say that to me all the time. Well, aren't they clearing their karma by admitting, the revelation of the method? And I say, well, that's based on the premise that by them telling you, then you have the chance to fight back, and then we just see who wins, right? But the reality is, if the 50 plus dead bodies trailing the Clinton crime syndicate is any indication, if you try to fight back, what happens? You think that gives them clean karma for murdering people? No, that's the
No,
most absurd thing I've ever heard. And I'll tell
that's
you, I do want to get into the Luciferian aspect of all of this, which is actually why I ultimately decided to read PJ's entire manifesto in the beginning, because that came up. And it's interesting because I've seen it out in the real world with my own eyes working enough, especially with the snowflake generation, that what you see is the first thing the Luciferian agenda tries to do is free you from the shackles of your conscience, you see.
yeah.
And the new age community pushes is this same nonsense. Oh, we're not here to judge people. My ass, we aren't here to judge people. I'm going to tell you right now that if I find out that you're a pedophile, I'm going to judge you very harshly for that.
Oh yeah.
It's absurd. It's so absurd. I don't even know where to start. But let's get back on track because I actually want to go in that direction. I just had a little bit different way of wanting to do it. So you've said many times before in other interviews, what you refer to it as the second technology. You always have people in the alternative media, others refer to it as the breakaway civilization and their technology, but you just refer to it as the second technology. And you've said that the second technology has been here since the Civil War. So if that's true, and at one point in that same show I was just talking about with Kevin Smith, you brought up Nemo, that there really was a Captain Nemo, and you talked about these bizarre flying ships and how the helium ruse came to be. But I want to focus on if the second technology, most people believe that that is the result of back engineering technology that isn't ours. So if we've had it since the Civil War, what are we really talking about? And I think perhaps we should reiterate what an EB is. What's an EB, James? Because we see constantly the EB is the ET.
Yeah. Extra biological entity. And I talk about this, and I say it quite plainly. The Air Force knew that there's a difference between the extraterrestrial and the EB. And the extraterrestrial was a sentient human being, and the EB is nothing but a mindless android. I refer to it, because I'm not particularly fond of them, I refer to them as chunks of meat sewn together with a computer terminal. And that's basically what they are. And the people that have experienced them, they've never seen any expression on them. They've never been able to converse with them. They have no reaction to anything that's going on. They do what they're supposed to be doing, and that's it. And there's no more to it than that.
I think this is so important, James, because there are actually people who've been abducted who've talked about the Greys being living cameras. And you've explained that they're probes that were created by another civilization way out in the great beyond to go out into the universe, collect data, and send it back because they didn't want to send their own people out because they wouldn't come back. The journey's too long, and those kinds of things. So they're basically a biological machine that was created to observe. I think this is interesting because of the watcher phenomenon. When you start to see the occult penetrating ufology and even NASA, you begin to see these weird kind of offshoots and similarities. So you have people talking about the watchers, and I remember one abduction scenario. I think, or maybe it was even an occult writer that was talking about the watchers are only there to watch and don't care what they watch. And the more I learned about EVs, the more I came back to this. So I want to try to get into, there's kind of a strange timeline of events once the Civil War takes place, with the advancement of technology and the occult marrying together with the space program. So let's go back to that for a moment, because it inevitably leads to the Luciferianification of the entire system, and it's very bizarre. So I would like to try to suss out what's really happening here. So why did the second technology begin during the Civil War? How did that come to be?
People don't realize that there was just a matter of fierce competition in building the Transcontinental Railroad. The series on television, Hell on Wheels, is very good because it's very true to the times. But you have to understand that the competition in the industry still hadn't worked out the cartels. There was still a lot of jousting for position and so forth. So the elimination of competition was so strong that by the time that Edison got involved with it, the powers that be that had already created cartels decided that they had to control the advance of technology and science because this was a threat to them. They could get rid of what the cartel was selling. It could revamp, like Tesla, being able to broadcast electricity. It would be free. These were concerns that they wanted to control and keep from happening. And they used Edison and let him apply for so many patents without any kind of a model, without any proof of its feasibility to actually exist. And so today, when anybody comes up with something that's threatening to the powers that be and their cartels, the patent office will, when they go to register this patent, there'll be people that jump in and file complaints, and usually the government, that you're infringing on a patent. Now, really, you're not, because whoever applied for the principle that this might be interpreted to represent didn't really deserve getting the patent because they didn't produce a working model, they didn't produce a feasibility for it. You have to spend 40 years and millions of dollars to get your patent, but you will get it. But who's going to do that? You know, most inventors are not millionaires, so it's a way of stifling. But the people behind this, you know, they want pretty much to maintain their market for whatever item they have, whether it's silver or gold or whatever it is, you know, diamonds. There's even a cartel on coal and oil and many things that you probably never heard anything about. So what they did was create a second technology because they wanted to have better things. They wanted these things. And so the Civil War showed them that they can do things from controlling the economy of a region, like the South, to controlling banking, to move in, to take over people's property without any legality whatsoever because they can control these provisional governments that are in the South. So the South became an experiment for this kind of crap. You know, that's where eminent domain came about. So with this being able to control how technology was utilized, how science was awarded with patents, and what they could suppress, came the second technology. And Edison was a big part of it. He was looked upon as a great inventor, which he wasn't. He had a school of inventors, just like Maupassant had a school of short story writers, and produced hundreds of short stories that got published just on his name alone.
Let me read something that you said during that same show with Kevin Smith in 2010, James. You said there has been a second technology in the world that industrialists have had and exercised and used to their discretion, but have kept from the rest of us because it would challenge their cartels and power placements, and they've had it since the Civil War. And you also mentioned that there really was a Captain Nemo. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I think people would find that interesting.
If you read 20,000 Leagues Below the Sea, if you read that, you'll see that Nemo hated slavery. His submarine was engineered to, in the story, to be able to hit a ship, a slaver, and tear it in two. Of course, everybody would drown, and the slaves would too. So Nemo was an interesting character. And Nemo had a connection with some people from off Earth. And he got in trouble with it. He was convinced that if he could knock out these slavers, that slavery would end. And they weren't. So that they didn't appreciate his killing all these innocent people. And this is true. This was actually happening. But I call to attention that his submarine how it was constructed, it was a natural icebreaker. So that would give you a clue as to these people, where they were located, and why that many years after the fact, he seems to have disappeared.
I'm sorry, I'm wondering if I misheard you or misunderstood. Are you saying that Captain Nemo's submarine was made out of an iceberg?
No, an
Oh,
icebreaker.
oh, it was an icebreaker. I'm
That's,
sorry, I didn't
that's,
hear you correctly.
this was in Antarctica.
Oh, wow.
And guess who
Okay.
the
The
people that
blondes.
it's
Yeah,
associated with were the blondes. Yeah.
right. Okay, so what I was trying to figure out was because you've got advanced technology entering the picture kind of early on. I mean, we're talking about the Civil War, but none of this was the result of back engineering anything. This was actually just legitimate work. Okay.
Humans are capable of, look, I started on a thesis, fusion of metals, and if I'd finished it, I might have given away how to produce the metal that would enable you to leave Earth. And before I realized what a contagion you'd be to the rest of the people out there.
Yes, I'm grateful that you did not complete
Yeah,
that work,
I
James.
didn't
I really
complain.
am. Because
I
I
re-
want to make sure people understand what this means. It means that the elite are screwed. They have nowhere to go to hide. They don't get to go to space. There are settlements on Mars and the moon. That's all gone.
the
And
biggest
anybody
book
who
to
says it
sell
isn't is
is the
lying to
biggest
them.
laugh imaginable.
Yeah, but they're still being fed the story, and
Yeah.
so they're not slowing down, which is concerning.
It
Yeah.
is, and of course, they think they can go to the inner Earth, and they don't know what the inner Earth is really. They
No, they're
think,
not allowed to go there either.
no, they well, what's there wouldn't want them. It's just like the extended community. They see what they'll do to the people here. The talk of depopulation alone demonstrates that these are monsters and that nobody wants them off Earth. And they got to the moon and Mars via EB craft, and they were there long enough on the moon to do a pretty concise work on lunar petrology, of all things. And
Yes, you had a book on lunar
I had
petrology
to work out on
once.
that, and I had a
Yeah.
Norwegian scientist call me on the phone and said, "My God, you still have that book?" And I said, "Sure." It was a government book. What was in it, data, the information in it couldn't be obtained unless they had core drilled. They'd been on the moon
With
in
the
tanks.
proven Russian lunar drilling tech? Probably. I don't know. It's just, it's so crazy, but
Of course, they talked about helium-3. There's no helium-3. Helium doesn't react with anything. It doesn't degrade. It's totally inert.
yeah, there's a lot of mis and disinformation in the alternative media about helium. I think at best, if the stories about helium-3 were true, what you'd actually have is helium. I think I saw it explained once this way that helium has three different states, and that helium 1, 2, and 3 are supposed to be respective of the state that it's in. But even then, I'm not entirely sure they know what they're talking about.
Well, when it's transported, it is liquefied. And the process for liquefying is a trade secret. And so much around helium is a trade secret because when helium first came about, when it was discovered on Earth, it was discovered as a byproduct of refining gasoline from oil. And a little of it would be given off, and they found out when they collected the byproducts how to distill it from the byproducts. But they didn't want the Germans, so this was back before World War I, they didn't want the Germans to know how to get it to put in their airships because it's not flammable. And, what the Germans were using was. So the Germans tried to buy it and they wouldn't sell it to them. And they lied about, it comes from natural deposits in the panhandle of Texas and all that BS. Well, they were storing reserves of helium in the panhandle of Texas. That's what they weren't telling them. But they were producing it, and the Germans could have produced it from oil the same way if they knew how. And even today, there are a number of people that would be extracting helium from the oil byproducts if they knew how. So what happens is it gets shipped out by a couple of companies in the United States, industrial gas companies. It gets shipped out in these containers. Now, the containers are $30,000 a piece. because they have to hermetically seal it in. It wants to escape and go into outer space. So they have to hermetically seal it, and the only way, even then, that it works is if it's in liquid form. So that's how they ship it out, and when it comes back with the byproduct of oil refining into gas. And they remove it because of the trade secrets and everything, which, I know. And I tried to deal once with a partner that we went up to a town, a small city in Pennsylvania, this one company. And I tried to sell them on sharing that secret with companies that they abroad that they would get a relationship with, which would save all that trouble, increase the efficiency of the whole thing. And of course, they didn't know what I was talking about, but this one scientist did, of theirs. And so he and I had a little chat. But, I've had the same problem with platinum, trying to open up platinum mines in the United States, which is not allowed. Cartel does not want hard rock platinum mined in the United States. We have more hard rock platinum than they have in South Africa, than they have in Canada, and that's where most of it comes from.
And of course, just so people understand, what we're talking about is the law of supply and demand. So in order to keep the prices of the products that they're selling inflated, they have to continually reduce the demand or promulgate the belief that they're rare. There's many, many other things. There's a really great documentary on YouTube called The Light Bulb Conspiracy that talks about the cartels, and it starts with the light bulb and then the pantyhose. And this is where planned obsolescence comes from.
A battery that has copper plates lasts forever. You change the chemistry of it every 5 years. I have a friend who takes lead plate batteries, and he can change the chemistry as long as the cells haven't fused. He can recover any battery, just like new.
The interesting thing about planned obsolescence is it betrays the agenda that they're selling, that the environment is being destroyed.
That's so true across the board.
Yeah, it really does.
They try to sell us global warming. And, of course, good scientists will tell you, whether they're climatologists or not, they'll tell you that's bullshit.
It is. The globalist mind job at the moment is, especially on the youth, is that there are too many of us on the planet making too much money that allows us to buy too many things, and it's our consumerism that's destroying the planet and the environment. So that's why Bill Gates said, we've got to destroy the middle class to save the planet. But you see, and I've said this many times, when I buy a product that I have to replace 5 times in 2 years, I don't feel like I'm living high on the hog. I feel like I'm getting screwed. And this is the problem. So the planned obsolescence makes sure that the product has a short shelf life so that you have to trash it and go get another one. But it's your fault the planet's being destroyed. You see?
Let me tell you what's the weirdest thing of all. If you need to replace, say, for instance, you have an all-in-one printer, really nice one, and you want you've had it a couple of years, and you need to replace the heads as well as the ink cartridges. So you go to the store, and you add up what that all costs you, and you can go over to where you can buy a new one with fresh ink cartridges, fresh heads in it and everything, for half of what you would pay for the cartridges in the heads alone.
Yeah, and that's the planned obsolescence model.
Well, that's their marketing scheme. The company that's putting them out in there. And look, the thing is, there's collusion between all these printing companies to keep that crap going.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to get that ink on their hands, and you can refill those cartridges, but in doing so, you get that ink on your hands or on your desk or floor or whatever. I got a stain on my rug.
Yeah.
From it.
It's a, it's a huge problem, and people have to remember that while they're busy blaming you for killing the earth because you buy too much stuff, just remember that their planned obsolescence model means the faster those garbage dumps fill up, the faster their pockets fill up. They can make products that will last years and years and years, which is a huge strain on the environment, but they don't. So we're not the problem here. But I do want to get back to, we've actually already been doing this for a couple of hours, and I know we could talk forever, but I do want to kind of get to the end of this so we can wrap this up because we've covered a lot of stuff. Okay, so this was the beginning of the cartels during the Civil War, and so let me ask you, because I was not aware until I talked to you, and of course I
Well,
went and
now the
researched it.
cartel started before that.
Okay, so what was the impetus for the Reconstruction, which really was what the Civil War was about, not so much slavery, which I did not know because they don't teach that anymore. What was Reconstruction really about in terms of these people keeping their power and whatnot?
Reconstruction, first of all, the Civil War was not over slavery. It was over the South had decided that they weren't going to send their cotton and tobacco to New York City to be sold by merchants out of New York City and by who were financing their operations by the banks in New York City. They were selling it out of ports in the South. And they couldn't have that. So what they did is they engineered the war. And the war, even Lincoln himself said, if I could end this war without freeing one slave, I would. So even the leadership on both sides, now I'm against slavery. I'm totally against slavery. With any conscience or without any sense of dignity, you would be against slavery of any kind. But that's not what the war was fought over. And of course, the slaves are no better off for many years after the war. They were no better off, and a lot of them were abused. A lot of them went into the army or whatever, and then were used as cannon fodder. They were called buffalo soldiers, and you can read about the history of that. But the blacks didn't get their mule and 40 acres that they were promised, And there were as many blacks that fought for the South as fought for the North, and people don't realize that. So yeah.
But I did notice, James, in that series you mentioned earlier was called Hell on Wheels, and it's
Yes,
fantastic.
I love it. I love
It
it.
was so good. Yeah, Cullen Bohannon is just,
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
my grandfather's name was Bohannon.
really? That's so
Oh yeah.
funny.
Oh
You know
yeah.
what's so interesting about that, though, is you see the carpetbaggers enter the picture, and you also see federal overreach begin
Oh
to
yeah.
really rub people the wrong way.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And they hang that poor woman.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's really, really good. I can't recommend it enough. It's fantastic. And it's like 5 seasons. So if you need to binge, there you go. If you need to check out
well,
of reality for a while, it's a good way to do it.
you get addicted to that one.
Yeah, I
Uh,
did. It was
I,
fantastic.
I loved it. Yeah, I did. And I spent a lot of time since I've been crippled up watching all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, that's what happens.
Yeah.
So James, let's get to, I have for so long been trying to understand how Luciferianism and the space program merged. So I thought maybe if the Greys were responsible for the second technology during the Civil War, that might help explain, interference early on, but you've ruled that out for me. We know that NASA had a predecessor called NACA, NACA. That was formed in 1915. The official seal was depicting the Wright brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics was a U.S. federal agency founded on March 3rd, 1915, to undertake, promote, and institutionalize aeronautical research. On October 1st, 1958, the agency was dissolved and its assets and personnel transferred to the newly created NASA. In 1917, which was 2 years after the creation of NACA, Crowley claims to have made contact with an ET called Lamb, and I've read about this many, many years ago. I still have the book. And the picture he drew of Lamb is clearly a gray. It's clearly the representation of a gray. Now, Crowley was a creepy bloke. Really, really creepy. So you've got this weird timeline. You've got him. So 1915, we get the predecessor to NASA. 1917, Crowley's talking about Lamb, the spaceman. 13 years later, you get the technocracy movement in the 30s, which is where the term social engineering came from. And then you get the real Luciferian creeps in. Now, Jack Parsons was the co-founder of JPL. He was born in 1914. He began corresponding with Crowley around 1939 and became Crowley's American representative of the OTO. Parsons dies in an explosion while mixing chemicals in his lab. His mother commits suicide when she finds out, and when they're going through his stuff after his death, they find a video of him having sex with his mother. There's also this really weird, creepy movie Parsons made in, was it, I don't know, 1954, called The Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. And it's got this woman in it that he always referred to as his Scarlet Whore, or the Whore of Babylon. And it's just the most bizarre damn thing you've ever seen. It's really gross. And this is where the pedophilia also starts to enter, the perverse, deviant sexual behavior. How did all of this and Luciferianism come together in this soup that we have today?
You have to realize what Lucifer is as a fallen angel, but he has been mixed with Prometheus to make him more acceptable. He's bringing the light of knowledge to you, whereas Prometheus brought fire to man. So he's bringing the light of knowledge. Now, there is a group today that easily lend themselves to the occult, and many of them become cults. In fact, one of the members of that group was here in Fort Worth and started a criminal organization. They call themselves light workers. Now, I'm not sure that every light worker is aware of what I'm talking about, but this person would prefer women and then would get them to do criminal things so she could have money to buy another church, which was never built. And part of her operation led to discrediting a person who was the son of Speaker of the House Jim Wright, and is the reason why he stepped down, because the boy was gay and got compromised by the church, and at the same time the Clintons found Jim Wright to be an obstacle, even though he was a Democrat, and decided to get rid of him. And so what they did is they started all kinds of rumors and everything. Well, Jim Wright was not a wealthy man. He had been Speaker of the House, very popular politician, but he wasn't wealthy because he wasn't corrupt. I lived in his district and knew something about him, and he helped me, and he helped anybody that went to him that he could help. He was a good man. But they tried to use the guilt by association because he had been a close friend of a fellow by the name of Malik. And Malik made it big in Fort Worth and built a skyscraper or two. So he had to be corrupt, right? Well, that was all BS, and everybody here in his district knew it. But Jim all of a sudden just steps down. And I believe firmly that was the reason why. And it was a church that my ex-wife and a paramour of hers joined behind my back. And one day she comes in. They call themselves light workers, and I remember that. She comes in one day and she says, "What do you think about taking an oath to the White Brotherhood?" And I said, "Get the hell out of it." I said, "That's Madame Blavatsky's BS. It's theosophy, and it's evil." Of course, she didn't listen to me. And the next thing I knew, she was doing some very criminal things. And eventually got involved in stealing $2.8 billion from the Treasury of Texas.
And I would like to let people know that James has written a book detailing all of this. It's the first book James has written that I'm aware of, and it's called Siege in the Davis Mountains. You can learn more about that from either one of our blogs. Again, mine is drowninginabsurdity.org, and James's is emvsinfo.blogspot.com. So, well, let me ask you, James, I mean, okay, so we've got the Vatican puts in a telescope in Arizona called Lucifer, and they're pedophiles. And we have plenty of people who have come out and said, yes, they have a satanic bent. They absolutely do when you get behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's
Are,
by Jesuits. That telescope was built by Jesuits and maintained by Jesuits.
and for what purpose? What are they looking for with a telescope
They
called
built
Lucifer?
track Hale-Bopp because Hale-Bopp fits in with one of their secret prophecies.
Okay, so they built that to look for Hale-Bopp. Well, Hale-Bopp came and went, so now what?
There's probably a couple more secret prophecies they might want to keep track of or whatever, but they didn't like the results of. I explained what the double nucleus of Hale-Bopp was and what would happen the second time that it came through our solar system. And sure enough, it did. And I predicted that, got in touch with a group of amateur astronomers who had enough money that they could rent use of a refractory telescope in a certain area for a short time. And so they would do that. And that's how good they were. And so I told them, I said, watch Hale-Bopp when it comes through the second time when it goes by the sun. And they did, and they saw it lose its double nucleus, and then they saw EMVs around the sun. And they saw them interact with the solar flares.
So is that what they were expecting to see,
No,
James? I mean, okay.
No.
What were they expecting to see?
Well, they were curious about the interests that the Catholics had in Hale-Bopp. And supposedly Hale-Bopp wasn't discovered until an amateur astronomer picked it up.
I guess what I'm really asking, James, is I meant the Catholic Church. I'm sorry, I didn't clarify that very well. Why is the Catholic Church so enamored with space? This is very strange to me, unless they themselves believe that the aliens and demons are, that's what they're applying to people from elsewhere. So what's really going on here? I mean, can you tell us what the prophecy was about?
You compare the Catholic Church to a corporation, which it has been since the end of World War II, when Mussolini's economists became in their hire and told them how to get out of the red. And since then, they've acquired a great deal of wealth, and they've used it vicariously. The issue of the church is they want to be on top of these prophecies and be able to use them to increase their influence and their sway over humanity. They have made a bargain with the New World Order that they will ultimately be the religion under that tyranny. Islam doesn't realize that, or they would target more appropriately the New World Order instead of playing into its hands.
I'm so glad you said that, James, because if these people, they're being used,
yes,
and when that's over, the thumb goes to them.
It's like the elite, too. The people that are ruminating in this grand deception are not the elite. The elite are going to be dispensed with, too.
Yes, which is good, I think. I want to go back to what you said before. I thought it was very interesting that the Luciferian ideal has been combined with the Promethean. And I see this being, morphed more and more into what's suitable to sell the hostile alien thesis. Because what's so powerful about knowing where we came from is it immediately dispels the reductive, condescending myths that we evolved from apes or that we were created by an alien race and we're their slaves. So, of course, they don't want people to know where we really came from and what a proud, wonderful people we once were. But does the Catholic Church actually buy into any of this, or are they just going along with it?
Well, now, the Catholic Church has done some turnarounds under this recent Pope, who is the Black Pope. He's a Jesuit, the first Jesuit.
And that is what the Black Pope means, right? It's
yes,
not, yeah.
Yes. Well, you have to understand that the Jesuit priest does not take an oath to God or to Christ. He takes an oath to the Pope. And he is in abeyance. When he takes that oath, he is face down on the floor. So, historically, they have selected, usually within the Jesuit order, the cream of the crop, the best that would try to get into the church, they would try to shuffle them. If they were educated and they were very bright, they would try to shuffle them into the Jesuit priesthood. And there they would do a number on them, making them, well, let's say the CIA, the Mossad, the KGB, the SS are all modeled on the Jesuits. The Jesuits was the very first of the super intelligence gathering organizations. And they have been that now since their inception as they were created by Francis Loyola. They can be diabolical. They have their own agenda, and that agenda may have nothing to do with the Vatican. They have had a great relationship with the SS when the SS was strong and powerful, and when at the end of World War II, they were helping many of the SS. They were supplying a railroad to get them out of Germany and get them elsewhere.
What about the elite themselves? I'm sorry, James, there's a little bit of a delay. I'm not trying to interrupt you. Do the elite themselves believe that it's someday they're going to see Lucifer cast down to the earth? Do they believe this?
I don't think so. I think that there's some that do. I mean, there's always some that buy into that horse shit, pardon the expression. But, you know, man creates his own demons. He creates his own gods when he has nothing better to do, when he can't appreciate nature, when he can't appreciate that nature is the hand of God. I mean,
Exactly.
Yeah. The design is there, the perfection is there, the fact
wisdom.
that we're given a wonderful planet, that we have seen all the evidence that there are people out there. I mean, I go back 300 years to the documentation of intelligent life on the moon that were seen by astronomers.
Transient lunar phenomenon, yeah.
Yes, and that we have seen these things in the skies time immemorial. And, you know, we had lineages that dealt with them, believe it or not. And Busagi is an example of that. The chambers that they found hewn out of stone in the Grand Canyon, where that salt, that battery salt came from, that's an example of it.
Now, now let me ask you, these battery salts that they found in the Grand Canyon, it's an amazing story. I mean, these are supposedly Egyptians that they found sitting dead around this table with some strange technology. Is this from a previous lineage, or what is this?
Well, yeah, it is commensurate with towards the end of the last extinction.
I see, okay. So again, we have them absconding with technology they found in archaeological finds and not releasing to the public.
Oh, all the time. All the time. And they find something like a time capsule that's obviously related to a former extinction because it's of a material they don't understand or because what may be inscribed on it. And what do? I mean, this goes into the back room of some museum, never to be seen by the public. Or it goes maybe to what they have in Area 51, or it goes, who knows. But it never sees the light of day as far as the public's concerned. I've seen one example of that, experienced it myself.
This is the drum that was referred to as the Ark, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Oh, well, that resides in a house in Ethiopia. You know, it's been there a long time. It's been there handed down. The guardian of it is, you know, about the fourth generation. When Constantinople was sacked, the Knights Templars salvaged that from sacking and kept it until they came under disrepute and were purged, killed on sight. They were friends with Suleiman, and they turned it over to the Saracens, and the Saracens got it to the only Gnostic church they knew of, which was in Ethiopia, because the Gnostics were the true Christians. What came of Peter's church was not true Christians. And today, if you look on the car of a minister, a Christian minister, on the back will be a fish. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the sign that the Gnostics used to designate they were Christians. And of course, they tell a different story of Christ and the one that makes sense of the cross.
That's
But,
right. You and I have talked about that before. Yeah. Who
and
Jesus really was, that Jesus wasn't a scene.
he was an Essene and he didn't die on the cross. And he had a child. He married Magdalene, Mary Magdalene, and he had to. I mean, Christ was to suffer every pain of the flesh. And the greatest pain of the flesh is to lose your family. So he had to have a child. He had to have a wife to suffer every pain of the flesh. And in the movie, with The Last Temptation, that's made clear. And of course, I am surprised it didn't cause more consternation, but the people were too stupid to see it, to see what was being said there, I think.
James, let's move on to it's the last major topic I wanted to discuss. If you want to get into Antarctica a little bit or anything else after this, whatever you want to talk about, the floor is yours for anything you want to talk about. But something that has me extremely concerned, I do want to say about the Catholic Church having been promised the role of the new one world religion. We already see the Inquisition mentality permeating our lives with things like, well, we should punish climate deniers. You see, we already
Yep.
see this coming back in, and it's very disturbing. But I want to talk about this new generation of kids called snowflakes, which I find so ironic because I always used to say that if people had proper knowledge of intelligent design, you couldn't snow them. And now we've got a bunch of snowflakes who have been trained to be concerned with three things, apparently: their crotch, their sex, and skin color, which are the most baser things that anybody could ever be focused on. It's horrifying, but I think the worst part about it is when I started hearing the word triggered. Oh, you're going to trigger them. They need safe spaces. I want people to recognize that the word trigger is a term from the mind control vernacular. And what
Yep.
it means is, if people have ever seen The Manchurian Candidate, you've all seen this in a film before, you've got someone who has been entrained to manifest a very specific way of being or personality or response to a specific word or phrase. That this is happening to the young is undeniable, not just in the word trigger, but you can pull up plenty of these videos right now. I think Mark Dice is famous for doing them, where he will go to a college campus and he will lay out all of these policies that are Trump's policies, and he will tell people or lead people to believe that they were, Obama or Hillary's policies. And as long as they believe it was Obama or Hillary's policy, they're fine with it. But the moment they hear the word Trump, they have been
That's right.
conditioned to respond to this word. And it's very, very disturbing. So I would like for you to talk about that, because you once said something I will never forget, because it was such a beautiful way of explaining how this slippery slope happens. But you once said that the first step to mind control is opinion forming. So could you elaborate on that and how our youth, their free will is being completely hijacked?
Well, I had a friend once. Every Sunday, I would get the New York Times, and one day he said, "You know what their slogan is, don't you?" And he said, "All the news that fits," or all the news that's something or other. And he says, "It should be all the news that fits." And I said, "Really?" And he says, "Yeah. Read their editorial page. Read where they put their stories. How many stories that you think are significant actually end up on the front page, and where the ones you think are significant end up back in a different section of the paper." And so I started doing that, and I began to realize that the New York Times paper, which I had so much respect for, was politicized heavily. And I became more critical of Manchester Guardian. I became more critical of some of the more popular sources where I was getting information. Then I began to read how school boards came about. And I read Sinclair Lewis's The Goslings, which talked about what took over public schools. But the main thing in impressing by redundancy, by repetition, impressing imprints on children and right on up through 18 years old and older, is that you create a sense, a false sense of power of expectation. This is how you should expect things to be. And if you repeat it, even though it may be something that is against what your parents or people that are older in your immediate environment would consider indecent, it becomes what is used to disparage them and make you think that, oh, well, you are in the now, or you are appropriate. And they're not. They're old-timey, they're this, and they're that. And then that's conveyed to the Constitution.
Yes, I was going to say it, but you beat me to it. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's painfully obvious this is what's happening, especially there. It's in your face. They're using the word triggered.
Oh, yeah. They don't know. None of them have ever read the Bill of Rights. None of them really have any respect for the Constitution. They don't understand it historically. They don't understand that it's a document for all time. They don't understand that the basis for it is the trials and tribulations that the colonists went under, having to accept taxation, having to accept the foreign governments, and having a class of people becoming more prominent in the colonies with more control and who could depend upon the English to enforce their form of local government. So it wasn't something that was just over a tax on tea. It was over the very freedom and the rights that they felt that they had earned by taming the environment, by the hardships they had endured that the English people and the English government hadn't and didn't have any understanding of, did not have the least understanding of, and this came out in the French and Indian War. So by the time that it came to an increase in the tax on tea, there was a lot more behind it. But of course, you had loyalists, and those loyalists continued to have sway, influence, and power. It wasn't a true revolution, or it would have gotten rid of them. But they were the ones, the DuPonts and the Rockefeller family later on, that established their wealth with wrecking, slavery, and smuggling.
Yeah, they're a bunch of degenerates. I mean, I think most people don't even realize that Rome was built by a couple of drug lords. You know, I mean, you don't hear that very often, do you?
You know, they were nursed by wolves.
Oh, yeah, right.
I imagine those wolves were underground thugs. But,
you know what's so sad about all that is that the globalists want to return us to a world where they turn themselves into gods and tell ridiculous stories like that. You know what I'm saying? That's what they want to return to.
Well, they want to mechanize the spirituality, and that's what I got when I listened to that guy that was the CEO of the company that has built a quantum computer. Before it was over, he was talking about, oh, this is going to lead into, you know, almost God. He didn't say it, but that's where he was going with it. You know, it'll allow our access to another timeline. It will create our access to a parallel universe and all this hard shit. Same crap these people that are involved in CERN that have come out and said this is what it's really about. You know, whistleblowers of a sort. I don't think they're whistleblowers. I think they're told to do that because people want to sublimate CERN into something it isn't.
Yeah, create an aura of intrigue. It's all just really very appalling.
One of the so-called whistleblowers that came out and said this said, gives his name. Now get this, he gives his name and he says, but if they catch me talking about this, they'll exterminate me. And that's the word he used, exterminate.
I'll tell you what, I've said this only one other time, but you know, you get this same kind of crap from the Project Camelot group. You know, they've got all of these whistleblowers that had super ultra cosmic clearance. But I'll tell you what, I was married to a spook once. It was a very short marriage. And I also employed someone once who had been a programmer at Area 51 for 15 years before I hired them. And I can tell you that both men made it very clear to me that they weren't going to tell you anything ever because they get recalled. And I know what that means, and they know what that means. But what I can tell you is that people who genuinely have that kind of clearance, unless they're ready to lose their life, they aren't going to tell you anything.
No,
They
no,
aren't going to go on radio shows for the last 10 years of their life and live every day like everything's fine. They will not let that happen.
let me say this about that. Now, I respect that. I respect you living by the oath that you took. The only thing I have is, and I have never taken an oath. I did take an oath to be obedient to God and country, what the military requires. But to take an oath of secrecy, no. And I never would. If that's what you choose to get into and you take an oath to it, I respect that. Now, when it comes to murder, when it comes to going into criminal activities, that's when I would say no. But that doesn't mean I would spill the beans and break that oath. I think that you always have free will and you exercise it when you were put up against the wall to do something criminal or to do something that is against your morals.
Assuming you have any, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
James,
Well,
I want to read something. This came from he was a teacher in Colorado in the 70s who was attending these summits on the environment when the UN was forming, and he saw what was happening and became very, very concerned about it. And he understood right away that the formation of the UN had nothing to do with what they were telling everybody it was for.
yeah.
And he made this really interesting statement. Okay, so people like Maurice Strong have often referred to this fourth world. And what it means is this new order having absorbed all of the others, and the fourth world being the only and final world left. And this is, of course, again, a reference to the globalist agenda. And he says, yogis and shamans refer to it as the fourth world wilderness, the lostness of the mind. The lostness of the mind refers to the collective consciousness. Persons will be coerced through lies, drugs, fear, and pain to surrender themselves and their ego to the collective consciousness of global governance. The fourth world will be much like a return to Caesar's or Babylon. And that's exactly where we're going. So I'm going to leave the floor open to you to discuss anything you want. If you want to discuss the EMVs, I always like to leave things on a light note because a lot of what we talk about is kind of heavy, and it's not all like that. I mean, I think what's so shameful about keeping humanity in the dark, not just about where they're from, where, their history. It's the majesty of creation at levels that we can't even perceive because they cloud it, they muddy it. What would you like to say to people that you think is important during these times, James?
I think that when resources are used wisely by compassionate leadership, when no one stands in the way of real progress, and what is found is not secreted but shared, when no one is respected for acquiring great wealth that they will never be able to consume, when there is order and love for nature and for its bounty, you have a different world entirely. And all of this is achievable. It's achievable here. It takes going through the same thing that we did to get free of England. And we did. Now look at the nations that haven't gotten free of England. Look at Canada. Look at Australia. They haven't gotten free of England. And they have crummy governments. They have people that live on the edge of poverty. I mean, you have countries in the Muslim world that are better off. You really do. They may not be in OPEC.
Yeah. I think, too, the other thing that's really so sad about maneuvering the minds of new generations away from anything that would actually help them better their own lives such as the Constitution, not only is it the amalgamation of 700 years of wisdom derived from tyranny, having to deal with that, but it also very, very simply and specifically lays out that the patterns of tyranny are always the same, tells you what they are, and then built a government around those patterns to prevent them from ever happening again.
Well, the main thing that you see with respect to corruption is inefficiency. You can't take a society and have a thing like Obamacare, where the suppliers of the insurance companies and so forth are supposed to get a subsidy in the government that would drive the government into bankruptcy. There was an article today on that, and it was in Sarsha Fall. Now, people poo-poo Sarsha Fall, but, you know, the fact of the matter is that Sarsha Fall has always been right on trends. Sometimes they're not right on every detail. But the fact of the matter is that since they claim to have access to intelligence that is derived from Russian intelligence network, the people that are supplying that information and intelligence to the Kremlin, RT and other sources that are coming out from Russian news networks, have never repudiated Sarsha Fall. Not once. And you would think that would be the first thing they would do. I think, and I've said this before, that I think that Sarsha Fall, I'm not trying to promote anybody or anything, but I think that actually Sarsha Fall is Putin's way of getting information to the American people in the most subtle way he can find. And some of it's a little bit naive. But I'll tell you what, as far as the trends, as far as inside information, with what we have from most of the news networks, including a lot of the alternative, nobody beats them. Nobody beats them. I post maybe on my wall, I post maybe a fourth of the Sarsha Fall reports. But just look at it. I mean, you've got a lot of little hit assassins online that are doing everything they can to debunk them, but they never, never succeed. Never. So,
Yeah, I was attacked once actually by someone who wanted me to know that, this was, don't you know, Sarsha Fall is CIA disinformation. But I have to tell you that because of you, I started taking a look. You post them often. If people don't know where to find it, they can find it on your Facebook page. And I have to tell you that at the very least, you're going to get some new neural patterns out of it, because it's a way of thinking that's so different from anything you find anywhere else. And I think that lends it its own authenticity, because it's not the same old crap being regurgitated, and it does fit together. It's funny because many times I will post separate articles. The way I post on Facebook is I like to post things in a string so that you can see this pattern. So I'll post these things, and then you'll post a Sarsha Fall article that basically is the summary of the other articles I posted.
Oh, I know. Let me say,
they're not that far off.
I warn people that in my book I use language differently. The reason I do that is I see patterns in your language that imply pre-drawn conclusions that are kind of corralling you towards this trend or this conclusion that is not warranted. And so I try to change the language up. Whether I succeed or not is up to the reader. You know, if you go into a museum and I say, look at that canvas, isn't that wonderful? And you say, well, I don't get it. Well, that's not your failing. That is no failing at all. That is, it hasn't reached you. So as far as that artist is concerned that created that, he didn't reach you, he failed. I had a friend once tell me that you should write in a way that your meaning is inescapable to any reader. And I disagreed with him because I had a context that he didn't have. But at the same time, if there wasn't premeditated meaning put into the language, he would be right. If that language was pure, yes, he would be right. He would be right. But it isn't. That isn't the case.
You're right, it isn't. And in fact, in the first book, what I was really writing about was intelligent design, but because of the stigma attached to it, I found another phrase for it so that people would make the connection and could look at it with a renewed vision, with a clarity that they wouldn't have muddled with all the stigmas attached to it.
Well, you do very well, and you created some phrases that I'm very fond of, and they are not commonly used, and they should be. People should be aware that there are a lot of things that are written, wittingly or unwittingly, with a predisposition. And of course, no writer should put his reader in a position of being predisposed towards something that may or may not be true. They should stay middle of the road and then allow you the license to lead yourself. Otherwise, it's politicized. Otherwise, it's dogmatized. Of course, there are a lot of people that have written a lot of books where that's the case because they have an agenda. And sometimes that agenda isn't bad. But nonetheless, the reader should always go into something with their eyes wide open to what the writer got some compulsion to do. If they did, there wouldn't be a hard sell going on from book to book or from idea or thought. And everyone needs to elevate themselves to having an opinion that is worthy of them. And a lot of people don't. A lot of people settle for something that's really unworthy of their intelligence and their integrity.
Yes, and I agree with what you were saying about writing, James. I didn't really understand that when I took up the task of writing the first book, but that is a big reason why I switched to fiction, because it just lets
fiction is more acceptable to people when you're dealing with ideas foreign to them.
Yes, it really is.
Excellent way. And really, I see in Hollywood, I find movies and I find some of these shows where these writers are doing that. I mean, they're good. They're good people. They're moral. Hell on Wheels is a good example of it. I mean, it is truthful about history.
It's excellent. It just really is. And I'm not it's set in the Old West, and I'm not a Western person. I've never liked Westerns, but it's fantastic. It's so good.
It is fantastic. It is fantastic. And I'll tell you what.
It's gritty. It's just, it's wonderful.
My stepfather was one. And, I was so privileged to have him for a stepfather. And I think about him today.
Yeah, the Bohannon character is really a good man in a world full of men that aren't. And he's perplexing to them for sure. But they need him all the time. So they, they're stuck with him.
He goes home and he finds his family slaughtered, his plantation destroyed. And so there for a while, he was a member of the resistance. I don't know if you saw that episode, but did you see the episode where this compatriot of his comes into town and he's nothing but a gunslinger and a thug? He confronts Cullen and he says, "Don't you remember what we did on the hospital train? They killed the wounded." And so that's bad, and that weighs heavily on his conscience. But coming back and seeing what happened to his family and everything, he was recoiling. And even in the movie, the most wonderful thing about any creation, whether it's a novel, a movie, or anything, is when they do a credible, realistic character delineation. And you see him going from being an obsessed individual looking for revenge to being consumed by getting that damn railroad done. And incredibly inventive, and a will that's unmatched and able to survive anything that hits him in the face.
Yeah, it's amazing, but I don't want to say too much more about it because I'm encouraging people to watch it. We want to make sure that they'll see if they watch it. It's fantastic. It's on Netflix now, and I think it's 5 seasons. I was really disappointed when that was the last season.
There have been several that I want to cry when they're over.
Yeah, there are some amazing revelations coming out, but they're subtle. You have to look for them, but they're out there. And I think the reason that they're kind of hidden is because they're not being promoted intentionally because they wouldn't be allowed. That's what happens when an opposing view becomes so well thought of and known because it becomes competitive. And when that happens, they have a tendency to destroy competing realities. So, you don't find a lot of marketing of these movies and series, but they're marvelous.
Yeah, they are. I would recommend, I could make up a list of series and, like Nowhere Man. But of course,
Hand of
they
God
so
is
many
really
things
good.
with that name. So many things with that name. They do that. Of all the fact that there's so many titles that they could apply that haven't already been used, whenever you find one
Oh,
that,
to confuse issues, yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
they do. They do. And, but you can get the one we talk about. You can get it on DVD, but you can't get it instant.
James, I watched the Nowhere Man series. Now, this has been a few years ago because I watched it as soon as I could find it after you told me about it. And I don't know that people back then would have been as receptive to it as they are now because reality is so persistent. People are a lot smarter than they were back then. But people want to look for it. It's on YouTube. I watched it on my television through YouTube. So it may still be there. It's called Nowhere Man. They'll know the right one when they find it because it deals with a lot of the second technology, mind control.
It deals with some aspect of the second technology, and it's interesting. And at the end, they had already created episodes. It was only one season, but they had created episodes for a second season, which they had been promised. But no, it was getting too close for comfort to the powers that be, so they canceled it. And of course, then they created an ending for it, a resolution to it, and it wasn't what I thought it should be. It wasn't in keeping with the quality or logic that the movie had created, or that the series had created. And so I was disappointed with that.
Is there anything you would like to say before we go, James?
I think that we're getting close to a point where a lot of people have to make up their mind and be resolute with whatever they decide, because we are getting to a point where realizing that Trump is our only hope. He said this to begin with, of course.
He did.
But there are people around him that should be around him.
Yes.
And I expect that happens. You have a lot of good people with good intentions, but they get bad advice. They get influences, undue influences.
And there are bad people.
But he's a good man, and like I said, he's already done enough to warrant a lot better regard than he's getting. And I see even people in the alternative media starting to whine about him. But you bear in mind the good that he has done just simply in getting rid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, getting rid of Obamacare, and getting rid of some of these super spending projects that the military would dump on him. And now they're having problems accounting for another bunch of trillions of dollars, like they did back before 9/11, and expect a big false flag to take your mind off that.
I really hope not, but that is their MO. That is how they operate. And now that Comey's gone, the gatekeeper, the globalist gatekeeper and cover-upper Comey is gone, there are some very nervous people, including Susan Rice. I would imagine Obama and Hillary are also very nervous, especially when the billions of dollars Obama stole from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac has come out recently.
Oh, that
It's
was
atrocious.
on Sarsha Fall. Sarsha Fall did an excellent analysis of the economics of the money that was diverted by Obama policy.
My God, they had a press conference and released the results of their, was it 4-year, 6-year long investigation into Obama? They released the press release, Arpaio and his investigator, and not only did they determine that Obama's birth certificate was in fact a fraud, they found the original they used to Photoshop. And of course, the world has no idea because the mainstream media isn't going to cover. They're covering for their globalist golden boy.
I'm waiting for people to get wise to that.
They are, James. I'll tell you, they really are. Even the young. A kid that used to live in our neighborhood years ago that I used to talk with all the time, I haven't seen him in years, came over and he was talking about how concerned he is. And he's like 19. What's really waking people up is the delusional Democrats.
That's a very telling age because that's the group. They call them the millennials. A lot of them were born before, but they lump them into the group of the millennials, and they're the ones that have been taught with the curriculum. And of course, you see that curriculum, it'll make the hairs raise up on the back of your neck.
Yeah.
But in California, they really work on them in California. And that's where political correctness was born.
You know, I used to tell people all the time, it's the most beautiful place I've ever lived, but I just could not stand the people. They're just the most phony people you will ever meet in your life. They are. And it was just really just creepy. I've got to be honest. It was like the Twilight Zone. You had to use the words they wanted you to use for things, even though they clearly knew what you were talking about. You know, like some states they say soda, other states they say pop. Who cares? Everybody knows what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
California, there were little Nazis about that kind of thing, and it was disturbing, I have to be honest. But we should wrap this up, James. What is the name of your book?
Siege in the Davis Mountains.
And where can people find it?
I'm not sure anymore.
Well, we'll make sure links are put up with the show. From what I understand, there is a hard copy now. Is that correct?
Yeah. I've got 7 copies left. I think I'll send them to some of the reviewers because, you know, they want some exposure. The Amazon.com UK was selling it, but they wouldn't sell it to anybody in the United States. So that told me it was banned in the United States.
Well, we will have a list of links where you guys can get it. But as far as you know, then it's still not available in the U.S.?
Yeah. I don't think anybody will be disappointed with it. And I would like to see it reach, you know, I'd like to see it reach people that need to take some things in consideration they may not otherwise. But I would have spent more time on it, but I wanted to get it out before the election. And I did. I wrote it in the VA hospital. And I didn't have a very nice computer to work on, but I made do. So I would have included a little more in it.
All right, James. We'll make sure we include the links. And once again, it's wonderful to have you back out in circulation. And I hope that more people will take advantage of some of the most wonderful insights that only you seem to be able to provide. It's really, I don't know, I feel silly saying it, but it's kind of fantastical, you know, in a wonderful way.
I do see some people coming over, and believe me, it doesn't bother me at all. They don't have to give me credit or anything. Don't change it. That's what I ask. In retrospect, a lot of it, well, in time, and that's an indeterminate factor. In time, everything that I've said will have a retrospect that will support what I've said. It's just a matter of time, and that's already happened. It's already happened, a number of things. And so,
yes, it has. All right. Well, thank you for your time, James. I appreciate it. Good night. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Crystal. You have a nice evening.
All right, we've decided to come back and add a little bit about Antarctica. It's a topic that we meant to get to and we didn't last time, so we're kind of adding this in at the end. I think it's interesting. I would like to point this out that I did hear a somewhat new voice in the alternative media community, a journalist who a few months ago said that he had been told by one of his contacts that the deep state, shadow government, however you want to look at it, was going to release stories about Antarctica to take all of the attention away from the pedophilia stories that were coming out. And that is exactly what happened. And we see that all of the hysteria over Antarctica came and left as quick as Zika and all these other stories that they've used to turn people's attention in a different direction. So I'm not really sure if there's anything really new happening in Antarctica, but there were some very, very interesting things that James talked about years ago. I know we have a lot of new listeners. A lot of time has gone by. People may have forgotten. So I do want to go back and talk about some of that. But before we do that, I wanted to share something kind of interesting that I found years ago when I was doing research on something called Horak's moonshaft. In 1997, a musical group called the Mooseheart Faith Stellar Groove Band released an album called Coronal Mass Ejection that included a song called Horak's Moonshaft. Again, this was in 1997. You can go look it up. You can find information about these folks on Wikipedia. They have a Facebook page, and you can download the MP3 of Horak's Moonshaft from Amazon.com. But the interesting thing about this is, even though James Horak didn't start talking about this until I think maybe 2010, 2011 or so, this came out in 1997. So the discovery of Horak's moonshaft is well known by other people, with us not so much. But the interesting thing about this too is that Horak's moonshaft isn't named after James. It's named after his uncle Antonin Horak, who made this really amazing discovery. A discovery that really helps shed light on both the strange happenings at Lake Vostok in Antarctica and the somewhat recent archaeological discovery in Romania. So let's start there, James. Can you tell us about your uncle Antonin and the Horak moonshaft? What is it, and how did he find it?
He was in the resistance against the Germans. He was a captain, and his outfit had been wiped out to one man and himself. The man was wounded, and so he was on the run. And he came across a gentleman who lived in a village in the mountains and who said that he would get him to safety and see about bringing him and his wounded gentleman something to eat. So he took him to this grotto, which is shaped like a half moon or a crescent moon. And then he said, don't go very deep in the cave, just as far as you need for shelter. And he made my uncle promise that he wouldn't go deeper into that cave. So a couple of days passed, and he didn't see him, and the wounded man was very hungry, and he thought that maybe he could find a dead bat or anything that he could feed him. So he did go into the cave, and he came across this long object that was shaped sort of like an ornate church spire. But it went so deep back along the shaft that he could not see the end of it. He couldn't tell whether it was made of stone or whether it was made of metal. It seemed to be a combination of both. And it looked like it had been pushed up from deeper in the earth and turned. But other than that, it was pristine. So he would go back in there from time to time to try to figure out what it was, and finally pulled his gun and shot it, and it glanced off of it, didn't leave a mar on it. So he was impressed with that. He wrote an article. You can find the article online. The article that I've seen several articles which are edited. They're not good representations of the article that I read that he gave me when I first visited my father and met my great uncle Antonin. He and I became pretty close in the little bit of time I was there. And he showed me his papers, which were more than what was in the article. And he did intimate to me that he thought it was otherworldly. But I think that over time, that what was curious is that Dr. Hynek visited him, and this must have been in the late 50s or very early 60s. And he visited him, and I don't remember my great uncle telling me that anyone was with him. Later on, this Theodore or Ted Gunderson, ex-FBI, called me up and said that he and Hynek had visited my great uncle in the 70s, and I knew that was a lie. So he wanted to know what I knew. And because he said that, I knew it was a lie, I kind of beat around the bush. I didn't give him much help, but I did tell him that I knew that Colleen Tony and Anna, his wife, were now deceased. Wonderful people. That they had, before they died, they had lived in Pueblo. And I told him if he wanted the best chance of getting Tony's papers was to try to get them from my stepmother, Lucerne, who was probably the repository since she was very interested in collecting things for his papers. Anna wouldn't have been any problem in keeping them herself because if Lucerne wanted them, she would let her have them. So I told him, and I never heard from him again. Evidently, Lucerne gave him the cold shoulder too. I told him not to say that I had recommended it, but Lucerne had something to do with breaking up any relationship that I could have had with my father. That's the only thing I can say, and I have some indication of that because I had been in a VA hospital where my father had been. And while I was there, I was given the inpatient job of assistant registrar. And when the registrar wasn't there, I had access to all the records. And I read my father's records. And his beneficiary correspondence was both compelling and revealing. So I don't have a very high esteem of my stepmother. And I think that she probably learned through a social worker that worked there that was a friend of my father's. I think she learned from him that I had been assistant registrar there, and I think it scared her, and so she felt like she had to do something. That's my feeling. That's my take. That's a guess. I don't know that for a fact, but that's my feeling because otherwise, when I tried to see my father once again, he gave me the cold shoulder like he thought I had the bubonic plague, so I never tried to get in touch with him again. And it also ended my relationship with my great uncle. But Ted Gunderson, I think he's deceased now too, but I've heard good things about him and bad things both.
Okay. I think what's really interesting about what you said, James, now Ted Gunderson, some people in the alternative media are familiar with him because he put videos out about chemtrails and saying how it was a crime against humanity. And he has really kind of a checkered past or story. But I think it's very, very interesting that someone from the FBI was asking you about your knowledge of this moon shaft that was found. What do you think was really going on there?
Well, I think that was his way that he thought he could get in with me and that I would tell him what I hadn't told anybody about.
Do you think it was an official capacity that he was asking or a personal?
I think he was just trying to get what he could out of me because I have a feeling he's always been a servant of, let's say, a very deep group. Hynek was working for Blue Book, Operation Blue Book. And I know that Gunderson was not with him when he visited my uncle because I know that it wasn't in the 70s. We talked about Hynek visiting him in 1961. So I know that's a lie.
Okay, now, so for the listeners, the diary that your uncle kept of his discovery, there is a page of that that's online, and we will include a link to that. I don't know how long it's been online, and it was nobody affiliated with you or your family that put it online, but it is out there for people to look at. So Ted Gunderson, FBI, starts asking you about your great uncle Antonin Horak's discovery with the moon shaft. Now, this is connected to Antarctica and also the somewhat recent find in the Busegi Mountains in Romania. But I think before we get to that, especially for new listeners, can you please explain, James, what it was that your uncle found? What was he looking at? What was its purpose? Where did it come from? What was it for?
Well, since I've had any kind of relationship with my great uncle, I've had a lot of experiences and a lot of information that I didn't have at the time. What he found was an engine. These engines are placed in a grid completely around the Earth. And what they do is they help maintain a orbital integrity of the moon with the Earth. And if it were not so, and a lot of astrophysicists can tell you this, that the moon is in the wrong place. It has an inconstant mass. It shouldn't be there. It's the wrong size for the Earth. There are many, many reasons why it's an anomaly. And the only reason, the only way that it is maintained in orbit around the Earth is due to there are machines inside the moon and these engines on Earth that make adjustments every time that the moon has a tendency to want to go out too far or come in too close. They make adjustments. And this is picked up because it keeps the Earth from having a constant gravity wave, for one thing. It is responsible for the many areas on the Earth and the moon that I think are consistent with each other, counterplay with each other, of differing gravitational readings, magnetic anomalies, all of them. And they do know that there is something going on inside the moon. They just don't want to
share that with us,
indicate the extent of it because it would arouse a lot of concern. And that's what they're all about, whether it's NASA or JPL or whomever it is. If they're an official government agency, keeping the lid on things from the public means more to them than doing anything else. And that is their true job, whether it's the FDA, the CDC, whatever or whomever it is in any government agency in this country and abroad, is keeping the lid on things, keeping people boxed into as far as their awareness of what's going on around them in the world and out there, to keep them from really figuring out and putting any of these anomalies together in a way that's meaningful and will lead anywhere.
Yes. And we're here right now because we're trying to get around that. So it is interesting. Now, you've been talking about this for years. We did a show, I think, back in 2012 called A New Cosmology to Address Cosmic Anomaly or something like that. It's very similar to that. It's easy to find out there. And it explains how our ancestors came here, that we are not native to this planet. Our ancestors came here from elsewhere in the moon, which is a giant spaceship, which NASA knows. It's been constructed. It's not a natural phenomenon. And we started out on Mars, and then we came here. We screwed up Mars, and then we came here. And it is interesting. There are stories of a group of people referred to as the Pro-Selenes that have discussed, their ancient stories talk about a time before the moon and the time when the moon arrived in the sky here on Earth. So were there people here before we came here, James?
Yes, but they weren't Homo sapiens. Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal were both here. Now, the Neanderthal wasn't very friendly and warred on the Cro-Magnon, for their women mostly. So between the time that we had established very well here and the time that we came, we saw the Cro-Magnon decline. I think that there are a lot of people that have, certain attributes of the Cro-Magnon, and they were wonderful people. They had a larger cranial cavity than we have. Their art, their tool making were so very well advanced and precise. They were probably just as capable as we are in every way. But where the Cro-Magnons came from, that is something that I am sure the evidence has been suppressed, because I feel that they really don't want you to know of the cross-cultural and biological things you may share with people that are from off Earth. Because they don't want you to know there's any intelligence off Earth.
That's right.
It started out as a religious thing, and now it's worse than that. It's something much worse than that. And
I do want to talk about that actually kind of as the summary when we end this part, James. But for now, I would like to stay focused on the moon, because for years you've been talking about how when we came here to Earth, the moon was brought here as part of the design to better tame the Earth, kind of regulate the volcanism, the upheavals that were happening to make it more livable. And we were being helped by another culture that we found on Mars who were actually getting ready to leave their situation, and there were adjustments that were supposed to be made that weren't made, and weren't made purposefully, because it made people easier to kind of con and control. And this was the beginning of the split consciousness. So could you maybe touch on that a little bit? Because according to you, based on design, Sentient humans are not ordinarily supposed to evolve and live in this type of design. If there's a flaw in the design that's then been carried over to us, and this is something we've been struggling with, and it's also being opportunized by the elites. So can you talk about this a little bit? Why is the moon having such a detrimental effect on our, why don't we have unified consciousness?
Well, we were on Mars for just about 50,000 years before we started the migration to Earth, because your ancestors wanted to do something that was overly ambitious. And in order to do that, they wanted to drill to the mantle and use that energy for it. And the mantle on Mars was too thin. So all that they did was interfere with the balance. Ideally, as far as a mantle is concerned, you want the magma that's in it to be evenly distributed. You cut down on the earthquakes, the volcanoes. That's one reason why, since Fukushima, that you have had quite an acceleration in earthquakes and volcanoes, with a lot of once dormant volcanoes becoming active again. So they made Mars less habitable. And Earth at that time was having a lot of vulcanization too. So controlling the mantle was a problem. And in order to maintain a healthy atmosphere and conditions, rain and so forth, getting that mantle under control required a moon. And that was one reason why Earth had such a turbulent landscape and an inconstant gravity wave and a number of other features that made it unfriendly. So when they decided that they would place the moon, they had placed around Mars, around Earth, and it was no better for Mars than it was for Earth, because it was too big and it wasn't of constant mass. So they put it around Earth, and of course they had even a worse time with being able to engineer any stability, any kind of safety to being able to keep it in orbit. So they used the help from people that were on Mars when they first came here, that had elevated very close to spiritual technology, what we call spiritual technology, where you lose your consciousness from the mortal coil to an energy field. It's something that cultures do on occasion, very rarely, but it's something that they do to survive and maintain their history, maintain their memory, maintain their pleasure with each other, their friendship, their love. It happens. It's very hard to achieve, and it has been achieved, in my knowledge, a number of times. And I talk about those groups and what they were named, the two of them that don't exist any longer in the mortal way. And they are spectacular people. And so they helped your ancestors, and they were responsible for placing the engines deep within the earth, just above the mantle, and for building the machines on the moon, which are deep inside. These machines and engines work together. When they adjust and make the adjustments, that's what's responsible for the lunar effects. And of course, they're going to be stronger when wherever you are, you're getting more benefit from a full moon than a half moon or whatever. Not that you are, a werewolf or anything like that, but that you are getting more of that energy, that residual energy, and enjoying a more consistent gravity wave at that time. It fluctuates. And I think that's one of the things that's responsible for a split consciousness. Another thing is no helium in your respirant. And then, of course, that's exploited. The people that helped you left before these adjustments could be made and calibrated where they were perfect. And so they left the directions on how to do that. In fact, Bosegi is one of the stations that can do that. And they also left directions for being able to use the moon to intercede between Earth and any oncoming asteroids. And that's why you see all these craters on the moon, and you don't see in proportion hardly any on Earth. So the Bosegi mountain find was one of these places. Those tunnels go down to where you can access these finer settings.
Before we go any further, James, I do want to point out that we're dealing with a technology that's just so far advanced. I don't know that the people here could even really comprehend what it is you're talking about. So you're using the word engine to represent a function, but what we think of as an engine is gears and cogs and moving parts, and these are something completely different. They're serving the function of an engine, but they don't look anything like what we would consider an engine, which I think is important to point out in the descriptions that you've provided over the years. And the other really, really interesting thing about this is you've been talking about this for years and years. And a couple of years ago, there's a fellow with a YouTube channel that had a camera that he was using to look at the moon. And he actually began recording a phenomenon that's related to what you're saying. And it is the most bizarre thing to watch. It looks like a wave moving across the moon at first, but as you look at this, what it looks like is the moon re-rendering itself. It's just absolutely bizarre. And you once said that if we were on the moon looking at the Earth, we would observe that same phenomenon here, that it's happening both ways, because this is part of the technology that's keeping the moon in parity with the Earth. Is that right?
Yes, and of course it's a phenomena that has a lot of magnitude, far more magnitude than some of the subtle things that affect consciousness here. And that shows you that there is a very deep understanding of this phenomena, so that even though it has so much more magnitude than the way that the frequency that we produce and transmit electricity, which affects our consciousness.
It's dirty, right? The way we're doing it now.
60 cycles per second is very bad. It's too close to the signals that our brain sends our muscles and sends our heart and so forth, and affects consciousness. Anytime that you have a feeling of losing your balance, or which some people do, they go to a doctor, the doctor say you're fine. I can't imagine what this is. Maybe drink less alcohol, less coffee and all that. For the most part, they are sensitive to these changes, these fluctuations. But how it affects consciousness has never been studied. In my humble way, I've studied it. And my findings are that it is something that can be minimalized, but, it's going to take money and effort that I have no access to. So when your ancestors were coming here, there were a number of them, I would say about 25%, that decided not to come here because they saw a caste system forming on Earth. In those hundreds of years that migration was going on, this caste system was not part of what your ancestors had in the system they came from. And that probably, who knows whether the caste system had a bearing on creating the split consciousness, or the split consciousness had a bearing on creating the caste system. It's just that then you had developed from that, you had this absolutism, you had this elitism, you had people that had no humanistic value whatsoever. And what we saw come out of that was that the settings were never completed. The Earth couldn't contain helium, which is an excellent addition to a respirant. And if you had it in your respirant, you'd live longer, you'd be healthier, and you might be more inclined to have unified consciousness. You would have so much greater access to certain faculties that I think you suspect are there, but you don't have a consistent access to. And sometimes there are some people who never have access to it, and when people say, well, I had this experience, most other people think that they're unstable or that they are making it up.
James, would you say that having helium as part of the respirant is the ideal environment for sentient life, humans, basically? Would you say that the helium aspect helps with the oxidation process?
It reduces it. It reduces it. And not only that, we talk about how if we were going to live underground, we'd have to buffer our oxygen and so forth. Well, you wouldn't have to do that if you had helium. There are a number of things that the addition of helium is very important to. Science has never been honest about helium. They should never have added it as an element to the periodic chart of the atoms. It is not an element. It's a condition of matter. I mean, an element is defined by what it reacts to or what it'll form a compound with or a mineral. Helium won't do any of these things. It's totally inert. It's so sad that it could have so many wonderful uses, but it's pretty well restricted to none of those uses. I mean, what's it used as a coolant?
Yeah, and that goes back to the cartels, and we've talked a lot about that earlier on. Well, so let me ask you this, James. You've often said that we're the only group of folks you've come across that suffer from split consciousness, but the universe is always trying to create something new. So the challenge for us is, can we finally tame it and master it rather than, can we work on unifying the consciousness? Because it does create some unique character traits and abilities out of the coping mechanisms that we use, which the extraordinary art, literature, things of this nature. How does sentient folks like Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal, how were they developing before the moon was brought here? Because was the Earth able to hold helium before the changes were made with the moon coming here? How did that whole thing work?
No, because it had no moon.
Okay, so that's why planets hosting sentient life, one of the main reasons that they require a moon is to hold helium and to tame the planet. Are those the two main reasons?
Well, there are two kinds of Earth that I like to talk about. I like to talk about the deep Earth and the Earth that has existed for the last 1.5 million years. If you go back far enough, you will find that there have been civilizations that existed before your ancestors came here that had reached a high level of technology and that they have left little evidence that's been shared. But there are so many anomalies on Earth, like find a spark plug in a lump of coal from 3,000 feet down in a mine. That backs up what I'm saying. I mean, you're talking about millions of years. And the Earth at one time probably had a moon, and it was a substantial, more naturally made moon, made to be compatible with the Earth. What happened is, things happen. I mean, some things are not a matter of runaway technology or of such an extreme opposition to change, both socially and technologically, like you have here. A lot of people, they think that all this technology is this and it's so wonderful for that because of damn cell phone and the new apps for it and all this. That's child's play. You want to know about technology and how extreme it can be, look at HAARP, look at CERN, look at the chemtrails, and how these things work together to reduce consciousness, to enslave, to help in removing unwanted populations.
So there were people here before we arrived in the moon, and this is something we've talked about in other shows throughout the years, is that the Earth has a history of its own that has nothing to do with us because we are not from here. We came here, it had its own history, and at some point when all of this comes out, we'll actually have an accurate historical record that will look nothing like the trash they peddle now.
Well, there are astrophysicists now that on the basis of scientific research, and I say scientific, the kind of work that microbiologists do come as close to being scientific as anything else on the planet, far closer. And if these people are not influenced to be untruthful. But there are a lot of people that have come to the conclusion that man didn't originate here. And of course, a comparison with animals that were here and have a known and obvious evolution here, that's absolutely true. We talk about finding the missing link. We're never going to find the missing link. Most of the times when they start talking about a missing link like Java man, Australopithecus, they're BSing. There are certain features, anatomical features, that they have to include in determining that we actually evolved here to be what we are. They accept that Cro-Magnon, for instance, is an intrusion into this environment. And he was. By that I mean a crashed spaceship. That has happened in modern times. You have people that, for whatever reason, are not recoverable by their own kind that crash here. Besides the EBs, and the EBs aren't recovered because they don't have sentience. They just make another one.
James, let's move to Antarctica now, because like I said, we have a lot of new listeners. It's been a long time since we've done any shows together. People forget things, so we kind of remind them, bring them back up to speed. So we've established again that we came here from somewhere else. And I do want to add, too, that this was another thing that I found really fascinating about, your revelations, James, because in the first book that I wrote, I talked about this really great book I read called Of People and Pandas, where they discuss this missing link nonsense, because not only have no missing links been found of animals or people, but they don't exist. And so that means that something else is definitely going on, even if it means that these species are being brought here from elsewhere. Their emergence is sudden. There's not a transitory species in between. And I think that what you're saying is another one of those anomalies that are resolved in that process of going through what really happened. So these machines are all over the Earth to keep the moon in parity. And then we go to Lake Vostok. You did it. And I think it was Kevin Smith. But you had a great conversation about Lake Vostok and the anomaly that was going on there, and how this also had to do with one of these machines having been found. And it's funny, I watched this horror show the other night. It's an old one called Ghost Ship, and it was this ship, with really weird stuff going on. And I started to wonder if maybe these engines are the cause of these types of anomalies. Maybe there's been some slippage or whatnot. So get into that for us, James. What happened at Lake Vostok with the Russians and these machines?
Well, I never lay anything on the Russians and their presence on Antarctica. And the reason why is that the United States and Russia have been cooperating in Antarctica almost hand in hand. I mean,
and in space. I want people to know that. Even in space, the only way anybody's getting to the space station now, even our own people, is through the Russians.
That's right. And the Russians are so far ahead of us in rocketry and have been all along. I remember that the first time I saw one of their rocket engines, I was so impressed. I saw it back when the Soviet Union was still extant, and they had a show here in my hometown here in Fort Worth, the Soviet space. And they were going to tour the world with that show, but while they were here, the Soviet Union fell, and they sent it back. Fort Worth, Texas was the only place where it was shown. And I got to see two of these rocket engines, and I mean, we just don't, we don't even know the metal they're made of. But they're elegant, and they use a vortex design, which is real simple, but we don't use it. We don't have it. We don't have it because the military-industrial complex is interested in potlatch and in not in actually developing a damn thing any better than the last one. Maybe doing something that hasn't been done but really has no purpose, like this last warplane that went over $1.5 trillion in cost overruns that Trump had the good sense to cancel. I mean, it's just potlatch. At the end of the year, you got a surplus. And what do? You got to burn it. Well, that's economic potlatch. That's what the industrial complex is good at.
And we're not believers in the Russia hacked the elections and all this nonsense. This is just more globalist claptrap propaganda.
Let me ask you something. In a country that is constantly involved in regime change elsewhere, what difference does it make if they did hack and they did help Trump get in? I mean, that's hardly regime change.
Well,
when did my country become the biggest hypocrite on earth?
I think it's been that way for a long time. We just didn't know it.
Because, that's very true.
They've been covering it up. But, this whole...
You know why I say that?
Why?
Well, during the Civil War, the French were bold. They knew that we were too involved in that Civil War to throw them out of Mexico, so they took Mexico and established an emperor, Maximilian. And after the war was over, he headed for the hills with the treasury of Mexico. And because he knew that we had a little thing called the Monroe Doctrine, which meant that we felt we ought to have influence over all the nations in our hemisphere. And that's what we used to justify what we did in Chile and San Salvador and Panama or wherever we want to go and throw somebody out that we don't like. And we even established, the School of the Americas in Washington, D.C. is built and made uniquely suited to that.
Yes, but we doesn't include you and me. We is the globalist agenda, and they're interested in putting puppets in. But so let's go back to Antarctica and Lake Vostok, James. What happened there that had so many people focused on it? What was the anomaly, the weird magnetic anomaly under the ice at Lake Vostok in Antarctica?
Well, Lake Vostok is very deep, and land masses change. And due to continental drift, it's nothing else. But one of the engines got pushed sideways there, so that they had the detectable magnetic anomaly that they couldn't figure out. Well, in the meantime, they found one of these engines that had been pushed up by uplift. And they knew, they were real interested in my great uncle's article.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, James, but I want to make sure we're being clear with the audience. So when you say they found an engine and were interested in your uncle's work, who are you talking about? Is this Russia?
No, agencies. See, there are agencies that have their own agendas. The CIA more than anyone else. And then in the last few years, the NSA.
Okay, so when you say they found an engine, who are we talking about specifically?
Well, the people that Ted Gunderson was working for. Now,
that's interesting.
Ted Gunderson, sort of was a whistleblower as far as the FBI was concerned, but I think that's because he decided to work for somebody else, like the CIA. So what he did was, in order to get inside the alternative community, to be able to be a gatekeeper like some of the others that we've seen come and go, Richard Hoagland for one, so that he could be instrumental in, guiding discovery, guiding acknowledgement of things, and limiting it. So what he did was he was trying to find out what he could about these engines. They knew that something was in Lake Vostok that was causing a major disturbance. And one of the things about the military-industrial complex is they have an ear to all of this. They have used a great deal of money to acquire that kind of insight to every agency of the government, even Social Security and the VA. So they are delivering on a basis of what their own agendas are. But at the same time, they come across something that causes a magnetic gravitational disturbance of a high order. What do any of them want to do? They want to see how bad can get. In other words, weaponizing it. That's what you do. The first step to weaponizing anything is you want to know how bad can be. So they did find one of these engines, but they're 1,200 feet long. You can't cut them with any kind of technology we know, diamonds, lasers, anything. So they had to move that 1,200-foot object. And I imagine it took quite a bit of doing. Where did they move it? They moved it to Lake Vostok. Two of these engines were close together. And that's when all hell broke loose.
Where was the engine moved from?
I thought for a while that it was one that my great-uncle found. I'm not so sure now.
Oh, you thought it was the one in Romania?
They're going to be, after, let's say, a couple 100,000 years, uplift will push things up that are buried very deep in the ground. You have a feature called uplift. And that is when you take, for instance, along the California coast, the sediment that is eroded off mountains and so forth, even the Great Plains, builds up on the ocean shore. And then it gets to a point where it has the weight, the magnitude of weight to push up on the plates. And you have the Rocky Mountains formed in days. You know, the Rocky Mountains are new. With that uplift can come one of these engines.
Okay, so somebody in the deep state wanted to do an experiment with these things to find out what they really do. And like you said, how bad can bad get? How can we opportunize this discovery to wreak havoc elsewhere? Because that's really all they're good at. So they took one from somewhere and moved it next to the one under Lake Vostok, which was causing the magnetic anomaly readings there. And what happened when they moved these close together?
Well, I'll give you an idea. There was a lady who was going to be the first woman to reach the South Pole, expeditionary, and she saw something. She had come pretty close to completing her trek, and she saw something, from what I can tell and what I can gather, it was close to Lake Vostok, because she was on a schedule, and that would have been her schedule. And she saw something, and they didn't want her to talk about or know about it. So they went out, they sent in special forces out, and they took her. I've tried to follow up and find out what happened to her and what she had to say and everything. I can't find a damn thing. But there, at the time that this happened, it was supposed to be a rescue effort or whatever, you know. I don't buy any of that. And there were people there that had nothing to do with what was going on at Lake Vostok that were talking about the readings that they were getting off a magnetometer and other devices. It was going off the charts. So I think she saw something that happened maybe on the magnitude of what could go on at CERN. You know, it was so fantastic, they didn't want her to let it out of the bag. Now, this was like 15 years ago, and I was following it. I was trying to find out, and I put feelers out. I got a lot of people that I talked to, and I was putting feelers out, and one person seemed to know something, but they wouldn't divulge it. And the reason was that they said, well, you know, if I tell you anything at all, they'll know where it came from. So I wouldn't go on to jeopardize them.
So do you happen to know what they did with the engine after they did this little experiment? Do you know where it is now?
I would imagine that they have no ability to recover either one of them. If they did, they would have recovered the first one.
Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, okay. We're missing some connective tissue in this story. So the one that they discovered under Lake Vostok, as you said, it's a very, very deep lake. So you're saying that basically they just drilled a hole and slipped it in and let it slide down. Is that the
not
kind
sure
of...
they even had to drill a hole. I hear various things about Vostok.
Okay, but it's irretrievable. I mean, how insane is that? What if the consequences were catastrophic and they couldn't recover it?
I think that it may have something to do with some of the problems we have on Earth right now that we didn't have.
In terms of...
I think, when's the last time that you've heard any of the readings associated with the faults in California? How they're displaced. I mean, they're supposed to be displaced at a steady rate. But I haven't found anywhere where those readings are given anymore. I have looked for information on the continental drift being as constant as it has been, say, 20 years ago. And I can't find anything on that. There's so many things that I can't find the information on that used to be able to.
And that's always a sign.
Yeah, that's a sign that they're not going to let enough information out so you can connect the dots.
Right. That's right.
There are things I could say, but, you know, they would know where that information came from.
Yeah, they definitely don't want this kind of information getting out, which just means we need to work all the harder at it. Because people on this planet have a right to know. They have a right to this information. It's their planet. It's their past. It's their history. It doesn't belong to this self-appointed little group of mattoid nuts. I mean, it just doesn't. So if we were to go back and kind of look at a timeline, James, I don't remember when the Lake Vostok thing happened, but we do know, in fact, we did a show on this. It was Race with Time 12, the last one we did, where we talked about before Fukushima, a lot of people in the alternative media were watching the earthquakes, myself included, because of HARP. And like the Haitian earthquake, for example, there were, it had the telltale HARP signal, and HARP generally will induce earthquakes 5 to 10 miles deep. And that's kind of how you know 5 to 10, 5 to 10, 5 to 10. After Fukushima, a couple of years after Fukushima, we started getting earthquakes 350 miles deep. I'd never
Yeah.
seen anything like it. So if what you're saying is true in terms of, I mean, you're speculating, but if it's right, the data that we had on earthquakes, once these two machines were placed together, should have jumped, and then it would have jumped again after Fukushima. But that data is no longer available, so people can't make that.
No, look, and I'm not kidding. Look how hard it was after Fukushima to find out what atmospheric readings of radiation was around the world. Now, the military and certain health organizations have got sensors that pick up these readings, but they weren't coming forth with them. All the readings you could get were private. People that were using private Geiger counters or scintillators or dosimeters. And, they couldn't be real accurate because unless they could get up at the high altitude that these planes that are used by the military and by certain agencies of the government in different countries, they fly over and they take these readings. Well, they're not sharing them. So we had no idea. And in fact, we didn't even know there was atmospheric fission going on until they started detecting tritium, which is created only from fission. And when they started finding it in the atmosphere, they knew that atmospheric fission was going on. And that was a few years ago at Fukushima.
And it's still happening because they've not done anything. Yeah.
They felt they better mention that. Yeah. And of course, tritium is deadly, right, as an isotope.
Yeah. All right, James, let's go back to Lake Vostok because there was this, I believe, deep state generated hoopla about Antarctica recently to take all of the heat off their pedophile friends. But there were some strange things. We did have dignitaries going to Antarctica. We had the Russian, I can't remember his name, the equivalent of the Pope was there. So what's going on in Antarctica now? Is there really anything new, or was this all just for press to turn people's attention away from things that were going on?
I think they were just divulging some things for the first time, probably to take the emphasis off of what was going on here with the election, with a number of other things that were coming out. When you put somebody like our President Trump in the position of having to defend himself, he comes out fighting. And they knew that with their resistance that they were going to get that. So they've got a hoard out media, of course, that is excellent at hiding the facts of anything that goes against their agenda, which is globalist. Then they needed something, that they could use, like 911 or any false flag that we've ever had to take emphasis off of what's going on. They don't want us putting in context. And that happened to be, I think, them sharing more about Antarctica than they would have otherwise. They keep these things. They keep them on the back burner and they bring them forward when they want to.
When it's useful to them.
Yeah, it's kind of like the way that they made a legend out of Lee Harvey Oswald. They had him on the back burner just waiting for the time when they had to remove someone that was inconvenient of import, like JFK. And so he was a ready-made false flag.
Yeah.
And anybody that's ever done any research that actually believes that it was Lee Harvey Oswald that fired the fatal shots is crazy. If they did any research and that's the conclusion they came to, they're crazy.
Or they're a stooge. right?
Yeah.
Because we have a
Well,
lot
a
of
lot of
those that just
stooges,
want to spin people.
yeah. You know, if you're lazy, you're a stooge when we're talking about research. Because if you're doing the research, it's not easy because you've got so much disinformation to wade through, and it isn't easy.
It isn't easy because they've put so many people out into the world to deceive people, and they always are reaffirming each other's story. It's the spin cycle they've got people on. So it's difficult to get to the truth in a lot of things because what could point you into the right direction, which we talked about a moment ago, has been removed from the equation of public knowledge.
If it was ever there,
Yeah,
it
that's
was
right.
ever
So
there.
it's
I
very
mean,
difficult.
they pounced on the evidence in so many cases, like 911. They sell everything to China and get it out of the country before there's any intrinsic investigation. And that's the way they do. They did the same thing at Oklahoma City. They had a lady there that wanted to know why DEA people didn't bring their children to work that day. When she did, she worked for some other company there or agency, and she lost her two children. And she wanted to know why they didn't bring their. And so the FBI intimidated her. And then nobody would write about anything she had to say or whatever. She had raised the issue, but then it got put in the background so that it was out of people's mind. There was no resolution. That's the way that they did with 911.
And really everything. I mean, the FBI was dirty long before Comey came along.
Oh,
Uh,
yes. Yeah.
and that's a whole nother conversation, but we did want to just add this information about Antarctica in terms of what was out there that nobody picked up on before they, tried to get people's attention off of Pizzagate by, rehyping it with really nothing new to add to the story that you've told, certainly. As I said in the beginning, one of the things I've always really loved about you, James, is not just the anomalies that you can resolve, but also that what you're saying really destroys the myth that they keep perpetuating that there's nothing new under the sun. So I would like to close with your thoughts and feelings about why is it so important for them to have us believe that there isn't something new under the sun? Why is it so important for them to hide these mind-blowing discoveries, even to keeping our own past from us? What's this really all about, James?
I am not an Alex Jones fan, but in naming his effort, his show, and so forth, Prison Planet, he hit the nail on the head. We're in a timeline that is completely indoctrinated by bankers that belong to a cartel that finance, I would say, 90% of everything that has any importance to them on the planet. And they control countries like Somalia. They control countries in Africa. They create wars. They make sure these wars are never resolved. World War II wasn't resolved. And the elements that were behind World War II and World War I, the Korean War, none of these elements were ever neatly tied, put away on the shelf or whatever. They kept fermenting. You have this antagonism with North Korea today and how it's used. It, again, is one of those convenient back burners that is employed whenever it needs to be, and which, anybody who's been around as long as me, we go ho-hum every time we hear anything new about this, or supposedly new, about all these ships going into the China Sea, all of the. How many times do you think I've heard this? I mean, they got the DNC, and they're always messing with each other. If it in the United States, it's North Korea. And the South Koreans just sit there, shaking their head. They've seen it so many times. They have loved ones still in North Korea that they like to visit. But that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because of the way that we want a pariah. We don't have Fidel Castro anymore. No, we have the young man in North Korea that has assumed the role of blackguard. And, of course, it's all theater. It's all theater. And, of course, I doubt very seriously that he has what he claims or that his intentions are what he claims. And people that go and visit, like they go and visit Iran, they say it's nothing like you're told it is. So much of this is theater. What's going on in Antarctica is theater. What's going on right now in this country with the crazies in California, and California's always had an abundant supply of crazies.
Yes, they have.
Yeah, and it spread to Oregon and Washington State.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a mental disease.
It is
But
bizarre, for sure.
these people don't have the slightest idea. I doubt if any of them have the sophistication of an ideology. They just don't like rich people unless the rich people are giving them money, like Soros.
You know what's interesting, James? The other day I saw a story about a woman, I think it was in Portland actually, who's opening up a school to adultify all of these kids because they don't know how to take care of themselves. They don't know the basics of getting a job. They don't have people skills. They don't know how to manage their own lives. And so it's basically a school for these people to turn them into adults. And, it struck me, well, the reason these people are not being taught how to manage their own lives is because the globalist agenda is to manage it for them. And if they've gotten any ideas of their own, it will be a struggle. They want it to be a nice, smooth, global citizen transition. It's really very sad. What message would you like to leave people with in terms of how to deal with what's going on and still find some joy in their life and be effective at change and whatnot?
I think satire is in order. And
Yeah,
there's an excellent video that somebody put on my wall about this kid that comes into this classroom.
that was me. I
But
put that on your wall because it's so true.
it is so, it's satire. It exaggerates in order to actually put you into the thinking mode about what's going on.
But it's not that big of an exaggeration.
No, every element in it that it addresses is very real. Now, it exaggerates. Good satire does that to bring you to look at this. It's like any time that something is very meaningful, you are going to be more demonstrative to try to help people save themselves, the truck that's coming at them or whatever. And that's what this is. And it's humorous as hell. Let me tell you something. It bowled me over when I saw it. Good actors, good casting, and I really enjoyed it. I really did. Is it true? It's 75–80% on the money.
It is.
80% on the money. And it's like, I mentioned what the tradition of satire, one of the best examples comes from the early 18th century, and it's Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. And believe it or not, it is just as germane, just as relevant today as it was 250 years ago. And of course, in it abdicates with the Irish famine going on, and these people say, oh, it wouldn't be so bad if the Irish would just stop having babies. That, well, we could have these babies, and we use them to make up for the potato blight.
God.
Really?
I agree. I think humor is a great way to penetrate the entrainment. It helps pop people out of a perspective that's been laid over the reality.
Yeah.
It helps them see it better, pierce it, see it, smell it, taste it for what it is and will be if it continues, which I think is really important. So we're going to wrap this up. I'm glad that you're back, James. I know that people have missed you terribly, myself included. We're really happy to see you back in the saddle. And I really hope that other members of the alternative community will try to overcome their differences and explore what you have to offer, because they really are revelations. They really are. And I think that we have a right to them, and I think that we can grow a lot if we could learn to incorporate them into the way that we're viewing the world that we live in. It explains a lot. It really does. So thank you very much for your time, and give you a chance to plug your book and your website very quickly before we go.
Well, thank you.
Of course.
Well, it's certainly not being plugged here in this country. Now, Amazon UK was selling it, but they wouldn't sell it to anybody in the United States. That's what told me it was being banned here.
The name of your book is?
Siege in the Davis Mountains.
Siege in the Davis Mountains, and it's an ebook form currently. I will have some links out there for people to try to find it. If you guys have problems, let us know, because that's how we find out where it's being sold and where it's not. They're not actually calling James and saying, we're not going to sell your book here. They just don't sell it. That's how we find out. So,
I got some hard copies too. I don't have
okay.
very many of them, but I have
Okay.
some.
So if people want to get their hands on one of those, how would they do that?
Oh, just tell me and I'll figure out what'd be fair to ask so I can buy some more.
And they
Um,
can contact you. Do you want to provide an email
on
address?
my Facebook wall.
Okay.
Yeah.
On Facebook or maybe through the blog. And your
Yes.
blog is emvsinfo.blogspot.com.
You
That
bet.
is E as in Emily, M as in Mary, V as in Victor, S as in Sam, EMVS. My website is drowninginabsurdity.org, and this presentation is on behalf of our good friend Pat over at Information Machine, and that is information-machine.blogspot.com. So thank you very much, and we'll talk again soon.
All right, Crystal. You have a good day.